Hey guys, tonight we are taking a journey back in time, traveling to the very edge of frostbite, a place where winter was more than just shivering in your hoodie. It was a force that caused entire civilizations to nearly buckle like cheap lawn chairs under a sky heavy with snow and silence. We are going way back to a time before electric blankets, a time when a cold snap wasn't just some inconvenience, it was the stuff of legends. So before you settle in, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. It seriously helps, and I really only want the cool people to stick around for the ride. Now I'm curious, tell me in the comments what city you're in and what time you happen to be watching this. I want to know just how many of you are lying in bed at 2:43 in the morning with one sock that has mysteriously vanished. Alright, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins with whispers, icy whispers carried down through the sagas of the Norse. They murmur about a time, before the gods had even settled into Valhalla, when the world was teetering on the brink of an endless winter. The ancient Norse held a belief in something they called Fimbulwinter. This was a great 3-year-long winter that was foretold to sweep across the land just before Ragnarök, the end of all things. Imagine snow falling without end, the sun gone for months on end, and the howling of wolves growing louder than the voice of reason. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Now, of course, we don't have satellite data or weather apps from 500 AD. Because of this, scholars are still debating whether Fimbulwinter was just a vivid myth, or if it was an echo of a real, catastrophic climate event. Some historians believe it might have been inspired by one, or maybe even several volcanic eruptions that filled the sky with ash and caused global temperatures to plummet. It is completely plausible that ancient peoples, watching their crops fail and their herds freeze to death, came up with a supernatural explanation because, well, the idea that a volcano went off in Indonesia wasn't exactly part of their worldview. Just try to imagine yourself there, in a small wooden hall buried in snowdrifts that stand taller than your door. You can smell the smoke curling up from a dying fire pit and hear the quiet clinking of a mother's hands as she shapes a comb from bone in the near darkness. There is salted fish, but not nearly enough of it. Outside, the entire world is completely locked in ice. A small child presses their nose against a frost-covered crack of a window, desperately hopping to see a flicker of light, some movement, anything at all. But there is only snow and the howl of the wolves. Always the wolves. What's truly wild is that something eerily similar may have actually taken place in the 6th century. Around the year 536 AD, historians and climatologists tell us that Earth plunged into one of its coldest periods in all of recorded history. A mysterious veil of dust, most likely from a colossal volcanic eruption somewhere in the tropics, cast a shadow over the skis. For a full 18 months, the sun was dim and had a strange bluish tint. Crops failed all across Europe, and the summer temperatures dropped by as much as 3 degrees. That might not sound like a huge deal, until you realize that even a 1-degree drop can be enough to starve entire regions. The Roman historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, much like the moon. A Byzantine chronicler made the claim that it felt like an entire year had passed without any real sunshine. You can just picture the street markets with no fresh produce, only dried goods, with rats getting bolder, the number of beggars multiplying, and emperors suddenly becoming very interested in praying to literally every god they could think of, even inventing some new ones. Now, here is the quirky part of the story. Some scholars believe this chilling period may have been partly responsible for the rise of apocalyptic beliefs throughout Europe and beyond. People naturally started to freak out when birds began migrating in strange directions. Their crops failed, and the skies turned a gloomy shade of nope. There is even a theory that these years of darkness helped to kickstart the plague of Justinian, a real crowd thinner that ended up killing millions of people. It's depressing, yes, but it is also historically juicy. So Fimbulwinter might not be just a myth after all. It could be a memory, passed down and twisted through generations of oral tradition, echoing a time when nature sucker-punched humanity so hard that it was remembered for centuries. We often think of myths as just fluffy stories, but sometimes they are distorted reports of real events, coded in poetry and fear and wolves. Always with the wolves. Now, it goes without saying that not everyone agrees on this. Some historians argue that the event of 536 wasn't as globally devastating as it's often made out to be. They say that it certainly hit hard in particular regions, for sure, but that other places carried on relatively fine. There is a continuing debate about whether these ancient volcanic winters were truly civilization-breaking events, or just seriously uncomfortable periods. That is the thing about history, isn't it? It's one part fact, and one part very confident guesses made by people squinting at tree rings and ancient texts that could mean 50 different things. Still, if you had been alive back then, it would have felt like the end of the world. You wake up to find frost on the inside of your hut's walls yet again. Your mother's hands are cracked and bleeding from the relentless cold. The goats are looking thin. The village priest just keeps muttering about dark omens, and absolutely no one has seen a swallow since the last feast day. People are beginning to whisper. One old man says the gods must be angry. Another claims that this is the beginning of the end. And maybe, just maybe, they are both right. You roll over in your bed now, feeling thankful for your weighted blanket and your central heating, and you feel a chill of second-hand dread for those poor souls who were staring up at a sunless sky, wondering if spring would ever come again. Spoiler alert, it eventually did, but not before the cold nearly managed to crack the world in two. Let's fast forward just a little bit. Well, about 1,300 years or so, to one of the most infamous cold spells in recent human history. The year was 1816, and spoiler alert, summer just never showed up. You wake up one morning in June expecting to see sunshine, maybe hear some birds singing, perhaps feel a little dewy grass under your feet. But instead, there's frost covering the ground, your breath fogs up in the air, and you have to pull on gloves just to go and milk the cow. It's June in New England. They called it the year without a summer, and it was every bit as eerie as it sounds. Across North America and Europe, snow fell in July, rivers froze over in August, and crops withered away under ice-crusted soil that should have been blooming. Your family's wheat crop doesn't grow. The potatoes rot in the ground before they even have a chance to sprout. You find yourself swapping stories at the local tavern by candlelight, wondering if God has gone on vacation, or if this is the beginning of something biblical. But the root of this chilling event wasn't some kind of divine punishment. It was a volcano. Half a world away in Indonesia, Mount Tambora had exploded in April of 1815 in what was one of the most violent eruptions in all of recorded history. It blasted an incredible 36 cubic miles of rock and ash high into the atmosphere. That's the kind of eruption that doesn't just ruin a few nearby villages, it actually changes the weather for everyone on the planet. The sulfur dioxide from Tambora's eruption spread all across the globe, reflecting sunlight back out into space. Global temperatures dropped by up to 3 degrees Celsius worldwide. Again, that might not seem like a lot until you realize that in farming terms, 3 degrees is the difference between a successful harvest and a devastating famine. You're now living in Vermont. It's the middle of June, and a snowstorm begins to roll in. Not just a flurry, but an actual, full-blown snowstorm. You throw an extra quilt over the bed and you light the fireplace, but the wood is damp and it just refuses to catch fire. The family dog keeps trying to dig into the earth to find some warmth, but even the ground itself is icy. You haven't had a proper meal in 2 full days. Your neighbor ended up trading their last blanket for a single loaf of bread. There are rumors of food riots happening in Montreal, and someone claims they saw a man chasing a squirrel down the street with a carving knife. You let out a laugh, but it's not a very hearty one. The cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. Food prices skyrocketed across the board. In Ireland, where the potato crops were already vulnerable, widespread hunger turned into a full-on famine. In Switzerland, people were so desperate they were eating moss off of rocks. Livestock starved to death. Men sold their family farms for just pennies simply to buy some flour. It wasn't just the cold that was spreading. It was a blanket of panic that covered the land. And here's the quirky little twist in the story. Out of all this misery and suffering, Frankenstein was born. Yes, that Frankenstein. In the summer of 1816, a group of British writers, including a young Mary Shelley, were on vacation at Lake Geneva. But it was so wet, cold, and apocalyptic outside that they were forced to stay indoors, reading ghost stories to each other by the warm glow of candlelight. That's when Lord Byron proposed a spooky challenge to the group. Each person was tasked with writing their own horror story. Mary Shelley ended up writing about a mad scientist who constructs a man out of corpses. It probably wasn't what Byron had in mind for a beach read, but here we are. And while one writer was giving birth to modern science fiction, others were giving birth to, well, nothing, because they were all freezing. Records show that some European villages experienced 0 summer crops at all that year. Governments scrambled to import grain from other places, but the shortages were being felt everywhere. In the United States, many New Englanders fled south to find warmth and fertile land, which triggered one of the earliest large-scale migrations inside the country. Now, some scientists argue that Tambora was just the spark, not the entire fire. The early 19th century was already in the midst of a general cooling trend known as the Dalton Minimum. which was a period of low solar activity that made the planet naturally chillier. So perhaps Tambora just piled on top of that, turning a cool period into a total freeze fest. The debate still continues today. Was it mostly the volcano's fault? Was it due to solar cycles? Or was it just the universe being generally rude to everyone? Either way, the impact was truly global. In China, rice crops failed and a famine spread throughout the country. In India, the cold led to a failed monsoon season and helped to spark a massive cholera outbreak. This wasn't just some regional hiccup. It was a worldwide climate gut punch. It felt like Earth itself had hit the pause button and then forgot to press play again for 12 straight months. And still, somehow, you survive it. You manage to bundle up in layers made of scratchy wool and sheer desperation. You eat broth made from bark, you drink boiled weeds, and you share body heat with every family member and animal who will tolerate you. A few people start blaming witches. A few others blame Napoleon, because when in doubt, it's always safe to blame Napoleon. But most people just go quiet, hunkering down and praying for a spring that never seems to arrive. At night, you find yourself staring up at the sky and wondering why the stars look so strange, dimmed by tiny particles that float high above, invisible to your naked eye but powerful enough to change absolutely everything. You think about your children. You wonder if next year will be any better. It will be, but it will certainly leave a scar. Even today, tree rings and glacier ice cores still bear the signature of the year 1816. A thin, dirty layer, a frost ring, a silence in the Earth's natural rhythm. Nature never forgets, even if we sometimes do. And as you begin to drift off tonight, warm and cozy under your synthetic comforter with the thermostat humming quietly, you can't help but feel a little haunted by that lost summer. It was a time when the Earth said nope to sunlight, and millions of people shivered in the dark, wondering if summer was just a myth told by old people who remembered a time when trees actually had leaves on them. You would think that Earth might give us a break after that whole no summer situation, right? But nope. As it turns out, that freak year of 1816 was just one particularly nasty cold snap in a much longer, icy mood swing that we now call the Little Ice Age. This wasn't some quick chill. It was a multi-century stretch of unpredictable, bitter weather that draped itself over the northern hemisphere like a soggy, freezing blanket that you just can't quite shake off. We're talking about a period from roughly the 1300s to the mid-1800s. That's 500 years of longer winters, shorter growing seasons, and generations of people born into the kind of cold that didn't just ruin a picnic. It threatened entire economies, rewrote borders, and pushed societies to their absolute edge. This is the era of endless firewood chopping, of rivers freezing completely solid, and of terrified kings commissioning more fireplaces than actual policies. You now find yourself in France in the year 1315. Summer has arrived late, the rain refuses to stop, and when you finally try to harvest your grain, it's too wet, spoiled, and rotten. You try to salvage it anyway, but it molds. By the time winter arrives, there's absolutely nothing left. People are resorting to eating their seed grain, which means that next year's harvest is already doomed, and they are fully aware of it. In fact, the Great Famine that followed from 1315 to 1317 was so terrible that chroniclers described people digging up graves and eating leather shoes that were boiled into a sad, chewy soup. And that was just the beginning of it. The Little Ice Age wasn't a period of constant misery. It actually came in waves, with temperatures dipping especially low every few decades. But the overall trend was unmistakably clear: longer, crueler winters. Rivers that used to flow freely now froze over completely. Crops failed in repeating cycles. Even the wine grapes in England, which were once a brag-worthy point of pride, gave up completely. And let's be honest, if you can't even grow grapes, then something has gone terribly, terribly wrong. One of the strangest side effects was that entire industries actually bloomed because of the cold. This brings us to the Frost Fair. Imagine the River Thames in London frozen so solid that enterprising Londoners decided, hey, what if we just held a street festival right on top of it? And that's exactly what they did. The river froze deep enough to host open-air markets, puppet shows, dancing, and even temporary printing presses. You could literally buy a souvenir that read, "Printed on the frozen Thames, 1684. It's like Etsy, but with a much higher chance of hypothermia. Still, for all the quirky frost fairs and charming images of people ice skating in fur-lined cloaks, the broader picture was far less cheerful. Crops all across Europe consistently underperformed. Peasants starved. The price of bread soared to unimaginable heights, and every failed harvest was like a slow domino tipping toward unrest. Hungry people tend to get mad, and mad people have a tendency to light things on fire. Scholars today are still debating the exact cause of the Little Ice Age. Some say it was driven by reduced solar activity, particularly during a period known as the Maunder Minimum from 1645 to 1715, when sunspot activity basically flatlined. Others argue that it was made worse by volcanic activity, with eruptions like Iceland's Laki in 1783 pumping sulfur into the air and acting like a planetary sunblock. Some even suggest that massive reforestation after the Black Death pandemics absorbed more carbon dioxide and subtly cooled the planet. The thing is, there's no single smoking gun. It's more like a gloomy symphony of natural causes all playing in perfect, miserable unison. The sun dims just a bit. A few volcanoes belch out some ash. The ocean currents shuffle around like they're in a bad mood. And suddenly, your medieval village is scraping frost off your goat. You are in Germany in the mid-1600s now. The winter seems to stretch on forever. The river behind your cottage has effectively become a road. Horses are pulling sleds right over it. Your neighbor's child hasn't spoken in days, it's just too cold. The family pig died in the middle of the night from exposure. And you're seriously considering moving south, anywhere south. But the roads are completely impossible to travel on. And even if you could leave, where would you possibly go? Everyone is cold, everyone is desperate, and no one has enough soup to spare. There is this uneasy rhythm to life during the Little Ice Age. One good year might come along, a brief reprieve with decent sun and a possible harvest, but it's always followed by another bad one. People learn not to get too comfortable. The stories get darker and the artwork becomes even darker still. Just take a look at the paintings from this period. They are filled with gray skis, skeletal trees, and people huddled around fires like they are the survivors of some quiet apocalypse. And yes, it wasn't just happening in Europe. North America felt it as well. Native tribes in the Northeast reported longer, hungrier winters, and some tribes shifted their territories entirely just to avoid the brutal seasonal extremes. In the Andes, freezing temperatures messed with high-altitude farming, which led to food instability. Even the mighty Ottoman Empire saw serious crop failures and famines during the 17th century, leading to internal revolts and significant political shakeups. But here's the quirky historical gem that is tucked into all of that suffering. People got creative. Winter survival skills improved dramatically. Architecture began to evolve. Walls became thicker, windows smaller, and insulation got better, using everything from straw to manure. Yes, manure. You do what you have to do when your teeth are chattering at night and your cat refuses to come out from under the blanket. And then there's the open debate. Did the Little Ice Age really nearly break civilization? Or are we just over-dramatizing a bad cold front? Some argue it was mostly survivable if you weren't already poor or politically vulnerable. Others insist that its fingerprints are all over history, helping to fuel everything from the 30 Years' War to peasant uprisings in China. The truth is probably a little bit of both. Climate is the background music of history. You don't always notice it until it starts playing way too loud. You lie in your bed, picturing yourself wrapped in a scratchy wool blanket beside a peat-burning stove, trying to remember what a ripe apple even tastes like. You can hear the wind outside, rattling the shutters and whistling through poorly sealed walls. Your breath clouds the air, even while you are inside. The fire crackles and then slowly dims. You pull your hat down over your ears, hoping that tomorrow won't be colder than today, and hoping that somehow spring hasn't completely forgotten about you. You shuffle your boots down a cobbled street, your breath fogging in front of your face, and then you suddenly realize something very odd. This river right next to you, the Thames, it's frozen completely solid. And it's not just a thin glaze of ice, either. We're talking about horses pulling carts across it, children sliding on sleds, and a man selling roasted chestnuts from a barrel fire right in the middle of the river. Welcome to London during one of its strangest and chilliest traditions, the Frost Fair. It is the 17th century, and the Little Ice Age is in its full passive-aggressive swing. The winters have hit harder than usual, especially when a few consecutive years go full Game of Thrones. The Thames, which normally flows through the heart of London like a murky ribbon, slows down and finally stills under thick layers of ice. It freezes often enough and hard enough that entire events are thrown right on top of it. Picture a farmer's market that meets a carnival and a survival instinct all in one. You walk across the ice very carefully, passing a printing press that is clunking away on a table, surrounded by gawking crowds. You can even get a slip of parchment with your name printed on it. Printed on the ice of the Thames, 1684. A literal souvenir of climate chaos. There are puppet shows and bear-baiting pits. Because nothing says winter fun like a confused, cold bear, along with juggler troops and shivering musicians who are trying to keep their fingers moving enough to strum out a tune. You even spot a tavern tent that reeks of beer and wood smoke, where brave souls are drinking away their awareness that they're currently standing on a temporarily solid river. It feels like a strange, beautiful moment of joy in the middle of the cold, a wonderful pause. But behind the scenes, it's not really that charming. The very reason these frost fairs are even possible is because the cold is wreaking havoc everywhere else. The river doesn't normally freeze. It's tidal and wide and restless. But the changes in the climate have been pushing winter temperatures well below freezing for weeks at a time. Add to that a slower current, thanks to the old London Bridge, which weirdly acted as a kind of ice trap, and the water just stops moving. It turns solid, and suddenly you've got yourself a party, albeit a desperate one. This wasn't just a one-off occurrence. Frost fairs happened multiple times between the 17th and early 19th centuries, especially during the coldest decades of the Little Ice Age. The first recorded fair took place in 1608, and the last real one happened in 1814. After that, things started warming up again, and engineers redesigned the London Bridge, which allowed the Thames to flow more freely and resist freezing. So, ironically, climate change and infrastructure improvements teamed up to kill the frost fair forever. Progress, I suppose. You rub your gloved hands together and make your way toward a merchant who is selling meat pies. They look a bit suspicious. You decide it's best not to ask any questions. Behind you, children are laughing as they skid across the ice, followed by a very concerned-looking dog. Somewhere off to your right, a group of gamblers is playing cards on a makeshift table, using old coins and wood chips as their betting tokens. The whole thing feels like you've stepped into an alternate universe, a frozen Venice, a marketplace that is built on borrowed time. But for many Londoners, this whimsical scene was just a distraction from very real hardship. These winters were absolutely brutal. The poor froze to death in alleyways. Coal prices skyrocketed. Chimneys were choked with soot. Frost crept up the inside of windows in even the richest of houses, and ink froze in inkwells. The cold wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. And if the ice held for long enough, people got creative, which is how the fairs came to be. There's even a fringe theory among modern historians that the frost fairs may have helped to spread early ideas of democracy and rebellion. It's weird, right? But just think about it for a moment. This was one of the rare occasions where people from all classes mingled freely together. On the ice, the barriers between the rich and the poor blurred just a little bit. You could have a duke sipping mulled wine just 10 feet away from a chimney sweep who was trying to sell second-hand mittens. It was a temporary equality, courtesy of the frozen chaos. And then there's the big debate. How cold was it really? Some argue that Londoners exaggerated the cold in their writings and their art. That maybe it wasn't so much the temperature as it was the specific conditions, like the old bridge bottlenecking the river's flow or a particularly snowy year. Others point to records of frozen ports, ice-bound livestock, and meteorological journals to say, nope, it was legitimately Arctic out there. And when you see those souvenir prints, those crude woodcuts of carousels and tents on the river, it's hard not to believe that they were just documenting the bizarre reality that was all around them. But there's something almost romantic about it too. Not the frostbite, obviously, but the way that people leaned into it. When life gives you a frozen river, you make money or music or memories, or at least you try to. Humans are annoyingly good at that. Give them a catastrophe and a patch of solid ground, or in this case, ice, and they'll build a fair, hand out pies and print newspapers on it like it's just another Tuesday. The frost fairs slowly faded away as the planet began its tentative warm-up in the 19th century. They became stories that people told to their grandchildren. Back in my day, the river turned to stone and we danced on it. It's a little hard to believe now, standing on a modern, fast-flowing Thames which is all business and bustle. But somewhere beneath the surface, if you could just scrape away a few centuries, you would find footprints, boot marks, sled tracks, and maybe even the broken handle of a puppet stage, abandoned when the thaw came too fast. You return to your warm bed now, the image of a frozen London still fresh in your mind. Candles are flickering in the corners of your memory. A fire crackles from a barrel in the snow. Children are laughing across the centuries, and you can almost hear the creak of the ice beneath your feet. History isn't always warm, but sometimes, even in the coldest of stretches, it manages to glow. Now let's head east. Way east. It's the year 1812, and you're trudging through the snow somewhere in what should have been a victorious parade through Russia. Only instead of cheers and triumph, you're freezing your face off. Your boots are falling apart, and you're starting to wonder whether conquering Moscow was really worth all this frostbite. Welcome to Napoleon's Russian nightmare. It is also known as one of the most disastrous winter retreats in all of military history. If history had a blooper reel, this one would be the slow-motion faceplant that just never seems to end. You are a part of Napoleon's Grand Armée, and at the start of the campaign, things were looking quite promising. I mean, sure, marching hundreds of thousands of men into the vast, rugged wilderness of Russia was ambitious. Okay, it was arrogant, but that was Napoleon's whole thing. He was the man with the golden hat and the audacity to match it. By the middle of 1812, over 600,000 troops from all across Europe had followed him into Russia, forming the biggest army that Europe had ever seen. That is not hyperbole, it is a statistical horror. But here's the thing about Russia, it didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for him. Instead of giving Napoleon a traditional battlefield, the Russian forces just retreated over and over and over again. They used scorched earth tactics. They burned their own towns, they slaughtered their own livestock and basically said, if we can't eat it, then neither can you. And Napoleon, ever the egomaniac, just kept going deeper into the country. By the time he finally reached Moscow in September, the city was completely empty. And then it burst into flames, as in literal flames, burned down by its own citizens. Just imagine arriving at your enemy's capital expecting to find glory and instead getting a ghost town with a side of arson. You stand there, smoke thick in your throat, your coat already feeling too thin for the chill that's starting to creep in. You think to yourself, we should probably turn back now. But Napoleon waits and he waits for the Russians to surrender, but they never do. The first snowflakes begin to fall and then winter hits. And it's not just any winter. It's a brutal Russian winter with bone-snapping cold that even the locals complain about. By the time the retreat finally begins, the army is already in very rough shape. Supplies are dangerously low, horses are dying en masse. The roads are blocked with snowdrifts and frozen corpses. The temperature drops to minus 30 degrees Celsius. Your fingers stop bending. Your ears are completely numb. Your friend falls asleep in the snow and simply doesn't wake up. Another comrade starts eating a leather belt. Someone else starts eating someone else. You don't ask questions anymore. Here is your historical fact. Of the 600,000 soldiers who entered Russia, only about 100,000 of them actually made it out. And many of those who did were permanently disabled, disfigured, or psychologically broken. It was one of the most catastrophic military failures in all of recorded history. Not just because of the Russian resistance, but because the weather did most of the killing. Napoleon himself later admitted, "The cold killed us. Not gunfire, not swords, just ice and hubris." The weird part is, this wasn't even the worst Russian winter on record. There were certainly colder ones, but this particular winter arrived early and it came in fast, and the Grande Armée was completely and utterly unprepared for it. Their uniforms were designed for fashionable marching, not for survival. Their supply lines were too long and far too chaotic. Their food was either frozen solid or had already been eaten, and their enemy suddenly became very, very patient. Now, here's a fun fringe fact for you. Russian folklore holds that General Winter is a real force of nature. Basically, a sentient frost spirit who defends the motherland from any invaders. And to be fair, history kind of backs that up. It wasn't just Napoleon who got frost-slapped. Hitler's army tried the exact same stunt in 1941 and ran into almost the exact same problem. Snow, ice, and a Russian resistance that knew how to play the long game. But let's get back to you, limping along some forest road near Smolensk. You wrap your scarf tighter around your neck and carefully step over a horse carcass. The frigid air stings your lungs. You haven't eaten anything in 2 full days. Your musket is frozen completely shut. You can hear wolves in the distance again, but you're too tired to even care anymore. The only thing that is driving you forward is the grim hope of escape, of survival, of not being added to the long list of soldiers who came to conquer and ended up buried in the snow. Napoleon eventually abandoned his men and rode back to Paris. He said that he had business to attend to. The survivors of the campaign straggled their way home if they were lucky, with frostbitten limbs and 1,000-yard stares. France never fully recovered from the disaster. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered, and the rest of Europe, sensing blood in the snow, began to sharpen its knives. The scholarly debate here is a fascinating one. Was Napoleon's failure inevitable? Did he underestimate the Russian strategy, or did he truly believe that he could outpace the climate? Some argue that it wasn't the winter alone, but a culmination of poor logistics, broken morale, and blind ambition. Others point out that if Moscow hadn't burned to the ground, Napoleon might have been able to winter there and change the outcome of the war entirely. But as it stands, the cold was the tipping point. History may have been written by men, but this particular chapter, it was written by frost. You roll onto your side in bed now, your pillow feeling cool against your cheek, and you think about how strange it is that something so soft, snow, after all, is just frozen water, can completely break an army. How silence and cold and emptiness can defeat flags and horses and cannon fire. You shiver a little, but it's just from the thought. You pull the blanket tighter around you, safe for now, from the kind of winter that swallows entire dreams whole. It's one thing to freeze in the middle of a foreign invasion, miles from home and surrounded by enemies on all sides. It's a whole different kind of cold when you're just trying to win your own country's freedom, and winter decides that it hates you too. Tonight, you're not marching through Russia. You are holed up in a snowy Pennsylvania forest in the year 1777, with frozen mud up to your ankles and the faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. Welcome to Valley Forge, the American Revolution's most famously miserable winter retreat, where frostbite was far more common than bullets, and simply surviving until breakfast counted as a major victory. You are a soldier in the Continental Army, and by soldier, we mean you are probably underfed, underclothed, and definitely underpaid. You've got one threadbare coat to share between 3 guys, a pair of socks with more holes than actual fabric, and boots that are more decorative than functional at this point. The snow is stained with blood, but it's not from a battle. It's from your own feet. Washington's army has camped here for the winter of 1777-78 after a string of frustrating losses, which included the capture of Philadelphia by British forces. Morale is pretty low, and the supplies are laughably bad. The army is more or less holding itself together with hope and a whole lot of stubbornness. It is freezing. It is damp. And people are dying. Not in glorious battlefield ways, but slowly, from disease, malnutrition, and the kind of cold that creeps deep into your chest and just stays there. Historical fact time. Roughly 2,000 men died that winter, mostly from dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, and yes, the cold itself. Valley Forge wasn't a death camp, but it was certainly a true test of endurance. If you could make it through that winter, you could probably survive anything. You could probably even survive modern taxes. Now let's paint the scene for you. Your hut is barely finished. The logs leak wind, the roof leaks water, and there's a single thread of smoke coming from a tiny fire pit that chokes you more than it actually warms you. You're sitting with 5 other soldiers, eating what might be boiled shoe leather again, and trying your best not to think about how far away spring feels. It is hard to imagine freedom when you can't even feel your own toes. Then, something changes. A weird, prickly man with a strong German accent arrives at the camp. It's Baron von Steuben, an ex-Prussian officer with a flair for swearing in multiple languages and a surprising gift for discipline. He immediately begins drilling the troops, teaching them real military tactics, and whipping the Continental Army into something that resembles a professional fighting force. It's like the makeover montage of the American Revolution, except instead of haircuts and shopping sprees, it's marching drills and bayonet practice in the snow. Here's the quirky detail. Von Steuben didn't speak English fluently, so he would swear at the soldiers in French and German, and his aides would have to translate the curses into English for them. Just imagine being cold, hungry, and then getting yelled at in 3 different languages for not holding your musket properly. It was motivation through multilingual sass, and somehow it actually works. The soldiers respond to it. They learn. They improve. What starts as a half-dead militia emerges from Valley Forge in the spring as a real professional fighting force. They are better organized, better trained, and thanks to some late-arriving supplies, better clothed as well. The suffering had not been in vain. The army that limped its way into Valley Forge is not the same one that marches out. The scholarly debate surrounding Valley Forge is a nuanced one. Some historians argue that the suffering has been overly romanticized, used to build up the mythology of the American Revolution. Others insist that it was absolutely as bad as the stories say, perhaps even worse in the quiet moments between the battles, where men stared into campfires and wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. And the truth probably lies somewhere in between those two views. The suffering was very real, but so was the transformation that took place. You imagine yourself now, wrapped in a blanket that smells like ash and sweat, staring into the fire in your crude log hut. Your hands are cracked, your stomach has been empty since yesterday, and your comrade next to you is coughing in that way that makes your heart sink. But outside, you can hear footsteps. It's drill practice again. You groan, but you get up. You grab your musket, what's left of it, and you join the line. Because this isn't just about you anymore. This is about something bigger than frozen feet and bad stew. This is about proving to the entire world that a ragtag army of farmers, blacksmiths, and fishermen can face down the most powerful empire on earth and not freeze into irrelevance. And somehow it all holds together. The soldiers who survive Valley Forge go on to fight in pivotal battles like Monmouth and eventually Yorktown. And though the war drags on for years, that winter becomes a turning point in the conflict. Not because of a great victory, but because the army simply did not fall apart. They endured. That's the thing about winter in history. It doesn't always kill you quickly. Sometimes it just erodes you bit by bit, whispering doubts into your ears while you huddle against the cold. And still, some people manage to rise against all odds. You roll over under your warm covers now, reminded of just how luxurious central heating really is. You don't have to wrap rags around your feet or dig a latrine through frozen dirt at 4 in the morning. You're not rationing powdered flour or worrying about whether the guy 2 bunks over is going to infect you with something unpronounceable. But for the soldiers at Valley Forge, that was life. That was winter. That was history, shaped by sheer, stubborn survival. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we still remember it. Now picture yourself on the other side of the world. You're walking through the narrow stone streets of Beijing, your breath visible in the air, your fingers stinging despite the silk-lined gloves you paid way too much for. It's early winter, sometime in the mid-1600s, and everything just feels off. There is no snow on the ground yet, but the sky is a leaden gray, and there's this tense, brittle silence hanging in the air. You are living in the final years of the Ming Dynasty. And whether you know it or not, your empire is about to collapse, and the cold is one of the main culprits. Here's the deal. By the 1640s, the Ming were already limping along. They were dealing with plague outbreaks, peasant uprisings, widespread corruption, and Mongol incursions. You can just pick your poison. But then, as if the dynasty hadn't already pulled the short straw, nature decided to twist the knife. China, just like Europe, was deep in the clutches of the Little Ice Age. They were experiencing colder winters, shorter growing seasons, weird weather patterns, and they had millions of mouths to feed. You walk through a market that is half empty. The grain seller is charging triple what he did just last year. A family nearby is arguing over the price of a single cabbage. A beggar kid follows you for 2 blocks before finally giving up. This isn't just a bad season. It's turning into a slow-motion economic implosion. Historical fact time. During the last few decades of the Ming Dynasty, climate anomalies caused widespread crop failures, especially in the densely populated northern provinces. Famines swept through the countryside. The Yellow River flooded yet again, displacing thousands of people, and when it wasn't flooding, it was freezing over. Locusts devoured what few crops did manage to grow. It felt like every elemental force had turned against you. And in China, where dynasties were believed to rule under the mandate of heaven, a run of natural disasters was more than just unlucky. It was a cosmic sign that the rulers had lost their divine favor. So people began looking for someone new to take the wheel. Enter Li Zicheng, a peasant who turned into a rebel leader and led a large-scale uprising that was fueled by hunger, desperation, and frustration with the Ming leadership. His slogan might as well have been, "If they can't feed us, they can't rule us." And honestly, it was pretty hard to argue with that. By 1644, Li had stormed the capital, Beijing, with shocking speed. The Ming Emperor, realizing that the jig was up, committed suicide in a garden behind the Forbidden City. Just like that, the dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries vanished into history. But wait, there's a plot twist. The new rebel regime didn't last very long either. The Ming had previously invited Manchu soldiers from the north to help them with defense. And well, the Manchus saw their opening. They rolled in, pushed Li out, and founded the Qing dynasty, which would go on to rule until the early 20th century. So yes, the climate didn't just break crops, it cracked entire governments. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Some Chinese scholars of the era wrote that the rivers were freezing too early, before autumn was even finished. In some provinces, people reported seeing snow in the summer and having sunless skis, which is eerily similar to what we now associate with massive volcanic activity or prolonged solar minimums. Was it just a fluke of the weather, or was it a full-blown climate pattern? Modern scientists are still debating that question today. One prevailing theory is that the global climate was impacted by not just one, but several volcanic eruptions throughout the 17th century, including the massive eruption of Mount Parker in the Philippines in 1641, just 3 years before the Ming fell. Combine that with the Maunder Minimum, that eerie period of minimal sunspots, and you've got yourself a deadly combination. Colder winters, poor harvests, and widespread political instability. As you walk through the hushed city streets now, you can feel the anxiety in the air. The emperor's banners are still flying, but fewer people are bowing when they pass by them. The food riots have grown bolder. Some government offices are simply empty. The bureaucracy, which was so famously sprawling and ironclad, has started to vanish. Local magistrates can't enforce anything. The grain reserves are gone. The tax collectors are in hiding. The empire is crumbling like a cracked porcelain bowl that's been left out in the frost for too long. And this isn't just a China problem. Across Asia, the same pattern appears. Colder weather, crop failures, and rebellion. In Japan, famines that were linked to cold spells also sparked social unrest. In India, the Mughal Empire faced both droughts and freezing winters that strained its once mighty infrastructure. Climate instability doesn't recognize any borders. It just sweeps across the map, flattening anything that is unprepared for it. The big scholarly debate around this period is how much weight we can actually place on the climate in the fall of the Ming. Some historians argue that it was only one piece of the puzzle, and that corruption, war, and bad luck were just as critical. Others point to ice core data, harvest records, and anecdotal accounts of extreme weather to say, nope, this was climate collapse 101. And again, the truth likely sits somewhere in between. Human systems are fragile, but they're also incredibly complex. Sometimes all it takes is a little freeze at the wrong moment to tip the whole structure over. You crawl into your pile of winter bedding now, with thick cotton quilts and a stone brazier flickering quietly in the corner, and you try to fall asleep. Outside, the wind rushes through the alleys of Beijing like a ghost. You can hear something creaking. Maybe it's a shutter, or maybe it's something bigger. You pull the covers over your head, half expecting to wake up in a different dynasty. Because in the bitter winters of the 17th century, it wasn't just people that broke under the cold. Whole empires shattered like thin ice. The wind howls outside your shuttered window, shaking the panes like a drunk man trying to find the keyhole. You think it's just another storm, another winter squall rumbling through your little European village. But this one feels different. It's January of 1709, and by the time you open your door, you realize that something is terribly wrong. The air slices into your lungs like knives. The sky is clear, but the cold is not normal. You step out into the street and everything is still, frozen, and silent in a way that feels unnatural, like the world has been placed inside a snow globe and then abandoned. Welcome to the Great Frost of 1709, a winter so incredibly intense that it blanketed Europe in record-breaking cold and nearly collapsed the fragile balance between survival and chaos. And no, we are not exaggerating. This was the coldest European winter in at least 500 years, possibly even longer. It was the kind of winter that turns rivers into roads and turns peasants into statistics. Historical records from all across the continent are crystal clear if a little frost bit. The temperature dropped and simply refused to come back up. In France, the thermometer hit minus 15 degrees Celsius, or 5 degrees Fahrenheit in Paris, which was unheard of at the time. For 2 solid weeks, the sun rose on a world that simply did not thaw. There was not a single puddle, not a breath of warmth. Trees split right down the middle with explosive cracks. Wine froze inside bottles. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight like tiny, feathered meteorites. Even the sea iced over along some coastlines. The earth didn't just catch a chill. It entered a state of suspended animation. And France, oh, France suffered terribly. You are there now, trudging through snowbanks in threadbare wool, heading to the bakery, even though you already know what is waiting for you there. An empty shelf and a long line of gaunt faces. The wheat crops had failed the previous season due to wet weather, and the frost only made things worse. What little flour remained was being hoarded or sold at scandalous prices. Some bakers had shut down completely. Others were watering down their dough and still ran out before midday. You pass a group of children who are warming their hands over a small pot of coals. A man nearby mutters about eating his dog. You hope that he's joking, but you've heard the stories. In fact, you've seen things over the past few days that you will never tell anyone about. Desperation wears many different faces. Here is your historical fact. France lost an estimated 600,000 people that winter and in the famine that followed it. That's roughly 2% of the entire population, wiped out not by war or by disease, but by cold and hunger. Entire villages emptied out. The roads were littered with beggars and corpses. In some towns, locals were paid to dig mass graves. The ground was so frozen that they had to use fire to soften it before they could dig, and the rest of Europe didn't fare much better. In Scandinavia, livestock froze to death inside their barns. In Italy, the canals of Venice froze completely solid. In Germany and Austria, food riots broke out. And in England, the rivers froze over again, but this time, no one felt like throwing a party on them. Frost fairs weren't nearly as fun when you had to choose between freezing and starving. Now for a quirky, if not slightly unsettling, fact. Some weather observers at the time believed that the freeze was a divine punishment. In Catholic France, preachers blamed moral decay and spiritual weakness for the cold. In Protestant Germany, it was seen as a test of faith. A few very imaginative thinkers even blamed comets, which makes a certain kind of sense if your science curriculum was mostly fire and brimstone. Meanwhile, actual scientists today point to a few possible culprits for the extreme cold. One is the continued Maunder minimum, that mysterious period of minimal solar activity that seemed to stretch on forever. With fewer sunspots, the sun's energy output was lower, which caused a subtle but widespread drop in temperatures all across the northern hemisphere. On top of that, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 1707 may have added a bit of ash to the atmosphere, just enough to help tip the scales into a deep freeze. But it's not a closed case. Scholars are still debating whether these events alone can account for the extremity of the winter of 1709. Some suggest that shifts in oceanic circulation may have played a role in it. Others argue that the compound effects of deforestation, agricultural shifts, and even post-plague demographic changes all contributed in their own weird ways. Climate, it seems, is never just about the weather. So here you are, back in 1709, in a small stone house with a fire that refuses to stay lit and food that barely even qualifies as food. You wrap yourself in every scrap of cloth you can possibly find, including a tapestry from your wall that smells like mildew and regret. Your neighbor hasn't been seen in days. You heard that his roof collapsed under the weight of the snow. The church bells ring out, not for a wedding or a festival, but for the dead. They have rung 3 times today already. You've stopped counting. Your cat sleeps on your chest at night, more for warmth than for affection. You don't blame her. You've done things that you wouldn't have even considered last year. You've burned books, family heirlooms, furniture, anything to feed the fire which gives back so very little warmth. You look out the window and the entire world is still frozen solid. It's like time has completely stopped, a white purgatory, and yet slowly the frost does begin to loosen its grip. By March, the ice starts to melt. By April, you hear the first bird song. The trees begin to bud reluctantly. A few green shoots poke their way through the soil, but the damage has already been done. Families are gone. Fields are barren. And in the back of everyone's mind is the same uneasy thought. Could it happen again? You roll over in bed now, listening to the hum of your heater and the quiet comfort of a world that has thermostats. Outside, maybe it's cold, but it's nothing like 1709 cold. Not the kind that freezes ink in pens and locks rivers in silence. You can't help but wonder what it would have felt like, looking at a sky so clear and feeling no warmth at all, just endless, hollow, cold. And knowing that there is nowhere to go but forward, slowly, carefully, through snow that doesn't care who you are or what you've lost. You are standing on a shoreline that doesn't belong to you, not in the way that we usually think of belonging. It's Greenland, and the sea wind cuts like a knife down the back of your neck. Behind you are turf houses, half buried in the snow. Seals are hanging, drying from wooden racks, and your breath puffs out in tiny clouds. The ice has crept closer to the settlement again, tighter than it was last winter. You are a Norse settler, maybe one of the last, and things are not looking very good. This is the story of the Vikings in Greenland, a civilization that held on for centuries in one of the harshest environments imaginable, until winter finally whispered, "Enough." The Norse first came to Greenland around the year 985, led by Eric the Red. Yes, that Eric, the exiled one with the killer marketing skills who convinced people to settle on an icy wasteland by calling it Greenland. It was a bold move, and for a while it actually worked. For the first couple hundred years, the Norse settlements in Greenland were surprisingly successful. They raised livestock, they grew some hardy barley, they traded with Iceland and Norway, and they even built churches with carved stone and imported timber. You can still see the ruins of them today, silent structures buried deep in the frost. These people weren't just savages in fur boots. They were medieval farmers with bishops and taxes and sermons and seasonal fish feasts. But starting around the 1300s, things began to shift. The Little Ice Age crept in slowly, like frost along the inside of a window, until one day it wasn't just a colder year. It was a colder century. The sea ice thickened around Greenland's coast, which cut off their trade routes. The growing season shortened, which meant less grass for their livestock and less hay for the long winters. The herds started to die, and the people started to leave or die right along with them. Here's your historical fact. The Norse settlements in Greenland, which at their height were home to over 2,000 people, had vanished by the late 1400s. The last written record we have from them is from 1408, a marriage ceremony at the church of H. Valsey. After that, there's just silence. No letters, no trade receipts, no shipwrecks, they were just gone. And here's the really eerie part. The Inuit who had arrived in Greenland centuries earlier from the north survived just fine. While the Norse struggled with their failing crops and dying cows, the Inuit hunted seals and whales and built homes that were adapted for the deep cold. They knew how to live with the ice. The Norse tried to fight it. They clung to their cows and their Christian churches and their imported ways of life. And the ice simply didn't care. You are there now, wrapped in a wool cloak that used to belong to someone who was stronger than you, walking past a field of bone-thin sheep. The fjord is frozen almost all the way across. No ship is coming, not this year, and probably not next year either. You know it. Everyone knows it. The bishop has been dead for 3 winters. The last boat from Iceland never returned. The supplies are low. The fish aren't biting. Some families are packing up what little they have and are heading inland toward nothing. There's an ongoing debate among scholars about what exactly caused the collapse of the Norse Greenlanders. Was it the worsening climate alone? Was it their isolation? Was it a failure to adapt to their surroundings? Or maybe it was all of those things plus a dash of cultural stubbornness. Some suggest that they could have learned from the Inuit how to hunt seals more efficiently, how to build igloos, and how to survive like the land wanted them to. But the Norse saw themselves as European farmers, not as Arctic nomads. They built cathedrals instead of learning how to build kayaks. They made butter while the world froze all around them. And maybe that's the strangest part of all, this quiet refusal to change. The Greenland Norse weren't wiped out in one dramatic battle. There was no plague, no volcanic eruption, no conquest. It was just year after year of winters that stretched longer, bit harder, and gave back less and less. It was a slow, quiet fade. No one thought to write a final letter. No one had the parchment or the ink to do it anyway. You walk down to the water's edge, where the ice has formed strange ridges that look like pale ribs. You think of the seal meat that is stored in the stone cellar. It won't be enough. You think of the church, half covered in snow, its bells completely silent. You wonder if it will all be buried one day, and if anyone will even remember that you were ever here. Quirky fact. Some of the Norse burials from Greenland show signs of scurvy, which is a disease of deficiency caused by a lack of fresh food, particularly vitamin C. This is deeply ironic, considering they were living surrounded by Inuit people who were eating raw seal meat that was rich in exactly the nutrients the Norse lacked. They literally starved to death while their neighbors thrived. It makes you think about how civilizations end, not always with a bang. Sometimes it's with the slow tightening of the cold, with a family saying, "We'll try for one more year," and that year never ends. And then, centuries later, someone stumbles across your bones in the permafrost, or a carved piece of wood, or the crumbled corner of a stone church, and they ask, why did they stay here? Why didn't they change? And you, if you could speak from the ice, might say, we tried, we hoped, we believed that spring would return. You pull your blanket tighter around you tonight, reminded once again of just how warm your bed really is, how far removed you are from the world of seal oil lamps and frozen fjords. But you can still feel the chill, can't you? The quiet dread of a people who kept waiting for a thaw that never came. You're standing at the edge of a river that doesn't know how to move anymore. The mighty Mississippi, the very artery of a continent, has frozen over, solid, silent, and still. It is January of 1918, and you are in the middle of what the locals called the Big Freeze. It was a brutal cold snap that gripped the central United States like a frostbitten hand and squeezed until everything cracked. The wind carries no sound, just pressure, like it's holding its breath right along with you. Somewhere behind you, a horse's breath curls into the air like smoke, and the trees creak like old bones. This was the winter when even the Mississippi River froze, from Iowa to Illinois to Missouri. You probably don't think about that river ever freezing. It doesn't freeze now. It barely even pauses in its march down to the Gulf of Mexico. But in the early months of 1918, it turned to ice that was thick enough for people to walk across. A river that usually carried barges and paddle boats turned into a glassy plain of quiet. People skated on it. They drove wagons across it. Someone even pitched a tent on it because why not? But it wasn't just the novelty of a frozen river. It was everything else that came with it. The winter of 1917 to 1918 was one of the coldest in modern U.S. history. And it couldn't have come at a worse possible time. World War I was still raging. The Spanish flu was just months away from sweeping through towns like an invisible firestorm. And right now, just surviving the weather felt like its own private war. You're in St. Louis. The snow has stopped, but it left behind 4 feet of silence. The temperature is hovering around minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit in parts of the Midwest, which is so cold that your spit freezes before it even hits the ground. Trains are completely immobilized. Coal is running out. Pipes are bursting like champagne bottles on New Year's, except no one is celebrating. You try to start a car, but the engine groans like it's dying and then it gives up completely. You don't blame it. The cold wave of 1918 didn't just affect the Mississippi Valley. It tore across the United States like a glacier with a grudge, hitting New England, the South, and the Pacific Northwest with equal cruelty. Record low temperatures were recorded in dozens of cities. Frozen livestock piled up in fields. Water mains snapped like twigs. The Great Lakes were so ice-covered that shipping nearly came to a complete halt. Entire towns became marooned in their own frost-covered isolation. Here is your historical fact. The Mississippi River has only frozen solid a handful of times in recorded history. 1918 was one of those times. People in Memphis walked right across it. In Davenport, Iowa, a train was delayed for days after it became frozen to the tracks. This wasn't a one-day freak event. The freeze lasted for weeks on end. And the damage wasn't just measured in degrees. It was measured in dollars, deaths, and disruption. Now, for something quirky. One of the oddest stories from that winter comes from Washington, D.C., where the freezing temperatures were so severe that the Potomac River iced over as well. City officials were forced to cut large holes in the ice just to maintain access to their emergency water reserves. And the people, they made the best of it that they could. They went ice skating on the reflecting pool, bundled up in every coat they owned, trying to look cheerful as their boots leaked, and their breath crystallized on their eyelashes. But the Midwest bore the absolute worst of it. Cities like Des Moines, Omaha, and Minneapolis endured weeks where the temperatures never climbed above zero. Schools closed down. Churches held services in freezing sanctuaries with no heat. Businesses shuttered, not for a snow day, but because no one could get there alive. And if you were poor, you just tried not to die. The Red Cross distributed blankets in Chicago. Bread lines grew longer and longer. Emergency shelters overflowed with people seeking warmth. And here is where things get even darker. All of this happened against the backdrop of a nation that was at war. Soldiers at training camps in the Midwest drilled in sub-zero temperatures. Letters that they sent home spoke of numb fingers and barracks that were filled with smoke from overworked stoves. In Kansas, at Fort Riley, the bitter cold was blamed for a strange uptick in illness. It was something that wouldn't be named for a few more months: influenza. It is morbid to think about, but the winter of 1918 didn't just freeze the land. It may have helped to incubate one of the deadliest pandemics in all of history. There's a debate among historians and climatologists about the exact cause of the 1918 cold wave. Was it just a statistical outlier? A freak alignment of Arctic air masses and jet stream dips? Or was it a ripple effect from volcanic activity that had occurred earlier in the decade? The data is muddy, But what is clear is that it was one of the most intense winters the U.S. had ever endured. And it left scars that weren't just frostbite. Back on the frozen Mississippi, you test the ice with your heel. It doesn't even crack. It feels thick enough to hold a house. In fact, a few towns built makeshift ice bridges to ferry goods and people across the river. It was cheaper than running a ferry boat. Children played hockey on it. Adults kept a wary eye on the horizon, praying that the thaw wouldn't come too suddenly. Because when the Mississippi unfreezes, it tends to do it with a certain amount of flair. Ice floes the size of cars break loose and crush whatever is unlucky enough to be in their path. You head home, your face completely numb, your coat dusted with powdery snow. Inside, the stove is barely keeping up with the cold. You put another lump of coal in, and you curse how expensive it's gotten. You read in the newspaper that city officials are now rationing heat and electricity. You pull on a second pair of socks, and you pray that the pipes don't burst again tonight. And somehow you manage to endure. You wake up the next morning and it is still cold. The river is still frozen. The world hasn't melted yet, but you are still breathing, still moving, still waiting for spring to arrive. You lie in your modern bed now, your sheets soft, the heating hum barely noticeable. You've never had to walk across a frozen river just to get to work, or boil water from the kitchen tap because the pipes have exploded. But deep down, you know, the cold that broke across the land in 1918 wasn't just about the weather. It was a stark reminder of how fragile our comfort really is, and how fast it can vanish beneath the ice. You are standing in a narrow Parisian alley, wrapped in whatever threadbare fabric you can layer on without looking like a walking laundry pile. The smoke from the chimney stacks clings low to the ground, curling around your ankles like it's too tired to even rise. It is the winter of 1788, and France is gripped in the icy jaws of one of the coldest seasons it has seen in living memory. You don't know it yet, but this miserable freeze is one of the final nails in the coffin for the French monarchy. The powder keg is already packed, and the fuse, well, it's made of frost. Let's set the scene for you. The winter of 1788 to 89 was so severe that the Seine River froze over yet again. The roads became completely impossible to travel on. Trees exploded from the cold. The wine froze in the barrels. People were burning their furniture just for heat. And the food, let's just say that if you weren't already a bread thief, you were seriously thinking about becoming one. In a country where most people already spent half of their income on food, the skyrocketing prices during the frost turned simple discomfort into full-blown desperation. Historical fact incoming. The grain crops had been in trouble for a while leading up to this brutal winter. First came the droughts, then the torrential rains, and then, just as farmers were hopping for a better harvest, bam, this epic freeze hit. The harvest failed yet again. With no grain, there was no bread. With no bread, there was no peace. The price of flour doubled. In some regions, it even tripled. Riots broke out across the country. Bakeries were stormed by hungry mobs. And all of this was happening just months before the storming of the Bastille. It is hard to overstate just how much the weather fed the flames of the revolution. Louis XVI was many things, but he certainly couldn't control the sky. He called for reforms. He convened the Estates General, hoping that a little bit of political maneuvering could calm the public down. But the people weren't interested in procedure anymore. They were cold. They were hungry. They wanted change, not another debate. You picture yourself now, shoulder to shoulder with a crowd outside a bakery. A cart of bread arrives and the scene immediately turns ugly. There is no line, just complete chaos. Elbows, shouts, and fists. A mother screams as her child is trampled in the scuffle. A man pulls out a knife. The baker is already locking the door, shouting that there's absolutely nothing left. You don't even get to taste the crust of bread that you fought so hard for. It's gone before you even know it. And here's the quirky historical twist. That very same winter also froze the fountains at Versailles. Just picture that. Ornate marble basins and golden cherubs entombed in ice, while the peasants in the cities were scraping together firewood and whispering about revolution. You could walk through the royal gardens and see everything frozen in time. A beauty that was trapped in silence. Some of the nobles hosted sleigh rides around the palace, wrapped in their fur cloaks and sipping warm, spiced wine. The contrast was obscene and people definitely noticed it. Then spring comes, but it's not the lovely, blooming kind. It's the kind that melts the snow and floods the streets, that turns the slush into mud. It's the kind that stinks. Rotting food, stagnant water, and disease. In the countryside, livestock carcasses begin to thaw where they fell. In the cities, the sewage backs up as the thaw clogs up the ancient drains. There is no relief, only more misery. By the summer of 1789, the people of France had been pushed to the absolute edge, not just by ideology but by ice. When the Bastille fell on July 14th, the air was hot, but the revolution had already been chilling for years. You might not think of the climate as being revolutionary, but it absolutely is. It doesn't need any slogans. It doesn't need any torches. Just enough bad weather at the wrong time, and even the sturdiest of thrones will start to crack. There's still a debate among scholars about just how much the hunger winter of 1788 to 89 contributed to the French Revolution. Some say that it was the final straw. Others argue that it was just one variable in a long and slow decline. But there is no question that the cold made everything worse. It tightened the screws on a system that was already rusted and groaning. It didn't cause the revolution, but it certainly lit the fire under it. Or maybe, more accurately, it froze the people into movement. You return now to your tiny stone apartment in the heart of Paris, watching your breath curl in the candlelight. You wrap your shawl tighter around you. You cough. There's frost on the inside of the window, and the bread that you bought 3 days ago is now hard enough to injure someone with. Still, it is all that you've got. The streets are quieter now. They are tense, like something is about to break. Everyone can feel it. The wind, the hunger, the rumors. Something is coming. And then it does. The revolution erupts. Heads begin to roll. Crowds flood the streets. The cold has given way to heat, political heat, social heat, and literal fire. The monarchy doesn't survive the winter. Not really. It dies in the spring, but its death warrant was signed when people started choosing between starvation and sedition. And here is the chilling question. Was all of this inevitable? Would the revolution have come even without the frost and the famine? Some historians say yes. The Enlightenment was already stoking the flames. But others argue that ideas don't move the masses. Hunger does. Philosophy never stirred a mob, but empty stomachs certainly did. You roll over in your bed now, imagining the wind rattling the loose shutters on a stone house somewhere in rural France. You can feel the quiet desperation of a mother watching her children sleep under two thin blankets. History doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just whispers through the cracks in the wall, through the draft under the door, reminding you that change doesn't always come with banners, but it always comes, especially when winter overstays its welcome. The sky is so blindingly white it almost hurts to look at. The wind doesn't whistle, it screams, funneling between the snow-drenched mountains like a banshee that has been let loose from some frozen purgatory. You've lost count of how many days it has been snowing. You're not even sure what day it is at all. Honestly, the calendar doesn't matter anymore. There is only before the storm and after. You are with the Donner Party, trapped in the Sierra Nevada, and winter is about to teach you just how cruel it can get when ambition outruns caution. You never thought that it would come to this. Back in the spring, you were optimistic, naive even. You had a covered wagon, a good horse, a few strong backs, and a promise of green fields in California. The American dream, but a bit dustier. The journey west was supposed to be long, yes, but it was supposed to be manageable. People had done it before. What could possibly go wrong? Spoiler alert. Everything. Here's your historical fact. In 1846, a group of around 87 pioneers set out from Illinois to California. They left late in the season. They took a supposedly faster but untested shortcut known as the Hastings Cutoff, and they ended up months behind schedule. When the Sierra Nevada mountains loomed ahead of them in October, they were already tired, underfed, and bickering amongst themselves. They were just 20 miles from safety, only 20. But that's when the snow came, and it didn't stop. By early November, the group was completely trapped. Snow piled up in drifts that were 20 feet high. Their wagons were stuck. Their cattle died. Trees snapped under the weight of the snow. And with each passing day, hope became thinner than the bark soup they were boiling for dinner. You imagine yourself inside one of their makeshift cabins. Really, it's just a log pile with a roof that leaks snow. The cold is not just outside, it is inside your bones. The fire flickers low. Your stomach feels like it's folding in on itself. People have stopped talking much. Their eyes are hollow. Their cheeks are sunken. A few of the children have died. A few of the adults, too. You don't ask who is going to be next. You just try not to be. And then comes the part of the story that history lets you forget. The cannibalism. It didn't start immediately. It wasn't taken lightly. But when weeks turned into months and there was absolutely nothing left, no game to hunt, no livestock, no bark, no leather, it happened. The survivors later said that it wasn't murder. It was a necessity. They waited until someone had died naturally. Then they made the unthinkable decision to do what they had to do to stay alive. It is horrifying. It is also deeply human. When you are facing death by starvation in sub-zero temperatures, the rules of society melt away a lot faster than the snow ever will. Here's your quirky fringe fact. At least one member of the Donner Party, a German immigrant named Louis Keseberg, was later accused of actually enjoying the cannibalism. Whether that's true or just a cruel bit of scapegoating is still debated to this day. After the rescue, Keseberg sued his accusers for defamation and he won a small settlement. But for the rest of his life, people whispered behind his back, "That's the man who ate people." And a rescue did come eventually. But it took 4 separate relief parties spread out over months to reach everyone. By the time the final survivors were brought out in April of 1847, only 48 of the original 87 were still alive. The rest were either buried in the snowdrifts or not buried at all. There is a fierce scholarly debate about whether the disaster could have been avoided. Was it really Hastings' fault for recommending that awful shortcut? Was it poor planning, arrogance, or just bad luck? Or was it just the weather, a brutal, early winter that nobody could have possibly seen coming? Some say the snow came early. Others argue the party was just too slow, too disorganized, and too stubborn. And maybe it was all of it. Maybe that is how tragedy works. Not one wrong step, but 10 smaller ones, all leading into a storm. You lie in your bed now, maybe under 2 or 3 soft blankets full from dinner. Your thermostat is quietly humming. But for a moment, you are in that snowy hellscape, watching the snowflakes swirl like tiny knives, wondering how long your body can survive on memory alone. You can hear the creak of the trees above you, the slow drip of melting snow into a pot over a low flame, and the steady silence of people who are too weak to even speak. You think about how many times in history the cold has not just killed people, but has stripped them down to their most primal selves. In cities, frost starves and protests erupt. On battlefields, it claimed soldiers by the thousands. But here, in the Sierra Nevada, it isolated. It waited. It pushed a group of hopeful pioneers into the darkest pages of American memory, and it froze them there forever. The Donner Party didn't die because they were weak. They died because they were human, caught between geography, hubris, and one of the most unforgiving winters the West had ever seen. And the survivors, they weren't heroes. They weren't villains. They were just people who made impossible choices because the cold wouldn't give them any others. And you roll over in bed, the heat from your body trapped comfortably beneath your blankets. There is no howling wind outside, no bone broth made from actual bones, no 20-foot snowbanks between you and safety, just a quiet night and the knowledge that not every winter story ends with a miracle. Sometimes it just ends. You're sitting beside a lake, but it's not the kind of lake you would ever swim in. The surface is flat, dark, and wind-stirred, with the jagged peaks of the Swiss Alps casting long, theatrical shadows across the water. There's a strange quiet to the place. It's not eerie exactly, just muffled, like the world has been turned down a few notches. You pull your coat tighter around you. It's supposed to be summer, but you can see your breath. You glance up at the sky, clouds again. Heavy, sullen, sunless clouds. You're in Geneva in the year 1816, and this is not a vacation. It is a Gothic prologue. They will call it the year without a summer, and you are already familiar with the cause. Mount Tambora erupting in 1815, flinging dust and ash into the atmosphere like confetti from the apocalypse. But here, in this moment, you are not thinking about volcanic ejecta or atmospheric sulfuric aerosols. You are thinking about how miserably cold it is for the middle of July. You're thinking about how everyone in the villa is getting a little bit weird. Especially Lord Byron. Yes, that Lord Byron. You're in the middle of a now infamous gathering of literary minds, all hiding out from the bone-deep chill and the endless rain in a borrowed mansion called the Villa Diodati. Byron has brought along his personal physician, John Polidori. Mary Godwin is here too. She hasn't married Percy Shelley yet, but he's here, as moody and poetic as always. They read ghost stories to each other by candlelight. They hold seances just for fun. The lake, shrouded in mist, stares back at them blankly. Outside, the crops are failing all across Europe. In England, starving farmers are looting grain carts. In Ireland, the potato crop withers in the frozen ground. In Switzerland, food prices triple and then they quadruple. There is panic, disease, and reports of people eating cats, bark, and even grass. But here, on the edge of the lake, the end of the world feels oddly poetic. Then one night, Byron throws out a challenge. Each of us will write a ghost story. You would expect this to be a harmless parlor game, the kind that you abandon halfway through once the wine runs out. But not this group. This group is peak romanticism, with a side of repressed trauma and storm-induced cabin fever. And that is when Mary Shelley, who is just 18 years old, has a nightmare, a vision, a flicker of something strange. A young scientist who is obsessed with cheating death, a corpse that is animated by ambition and lightning, a creation that is unloved. Frankenstein is born not in a dark lab but in the long shadow of a climate catastrophe. This wasn't just gothic drama. It was climate fiction, literally forged in a year when the sun vanished. Here's your historical fact. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was published in 1818, is widely considered to be one of the first works of science fiction, and it was directly inspired by the cold, wet, miserable summer of 1816. Her preface explicitly references the ungenial summer that kept her indoors. It is easy to forget that behind the literary legacy was a very real atmosphere of gloom and uncertainty. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Sunspots, or rather the lack of them, also get pulled into the conversation. The sun was oddly quiet in the years surrounding Tambora's eruption, with fewer sunspots than usual. Some scientists speculate that this solar lull may have amplified the global cooling. So, in a roundabout way, Frankenstein might owe its existence not just to a volcano, but to a sleepy sun. You can't make this stuff up. Well, you can, but Mary did it first. There's still academic debate today over how much the weather shaped that story. Some argue that it is overblown, that Frankenstein is more about industrialization, identity, or morality. And that's fair. But when you trace the mood of that summer, the eerie skis, the leafless trees in July, the news from home about famines and floods, it is hard not to feel the chill behind every single word. That creature, stitched together from dead things, is born into a cold and hostile world, rejected by its creator and feared by society. Does that sound familiar? Now imagine yourself there, huddled near a fire in the villa, listening to the others read the drafts of their stories. Polidori is working on something too. It's a story about a vampire aristocrat which eventually becomes the model for Dracula. The wind is howling through the shutters. The lamps are flickering. You are eating salted fish and stale bread, because the market ran out of vegetables weeks ago. But somehow this gloom is productive. It breeds invention, or maybe it breeds madness. And outside of this literary circle, things are decidedly less romantic. Across Europe, the food riots continue. Churches are holding prayer services for sunlight. In North America, the Northeast is facing black frosts in August. The crops are dead. The livestock are dying. There is a real fear that something fundamental has changed. That maybe this isn't just a bad year but a permanent shift. The sun, one farmer writes in his diary, seems to have forgotten us, and the scholars still can't quite agree on it. Was Tambora's eruption alone responsible for the dark summer of 1816? Or did it ride the coattails of the Little Ice Age, boosted by solar inactivity and a string of other eruptions across the globe? Tambora gets most of the press. But it wasn't the only volcano that was belching soot into the sky. There is even a fringe theory that a meteor strike may have contributed because apparently Earth was going through something. You lean back now, modern and warm under a thick duvet. Your room is silent except for the hum of your phone charging, the soft tick of the clock. Outside, maybe the wind rattles your window a little bit, but you know that spring is coming. You probably read Frankenstein in high school. You probably skimmed through it. Maybe you wrote a last-minute essay on its themes. But now you understand it differently. Not just as a story about monsters, but as a story that was born from weather so severe that it changed culture. The year without a summer didn't just freeze the crops. It froze imaginations in place long enough for them to thaw into something new, something strange, haunting, and beautiful, in the way that only something that is forged in desperation can be. And that is the coldest truth of all. Sometimes, the deepest winter doesn't kill the story, it creates it. You're marching through snow that rises past your knees. Your breath is coming out in short, ragged puffs that instantly freeze in the air. Your rifle weighs twice what it should, soaked and crusted with ice. And your fingers, well, you stopped feeling them about an hour ago. You don't know exactly where you are, just that it's northern Finland. It is 1939, and this is not how you thought a war would go. You are a Soviet soldier, and you are discovering firsthand that invading a country that is nicknamed the Land of 1,000 Lakes also means the land of 1,000 frozen ambushes. Welcome to the Winter War, where winter wasn't just a backdrop, it was the main character. Let's rewind a little bit. It's late November, and the Soviet Union, fresh from dividing Poland with Nazi Germany, decides that it is time to pressure Finland into ceding some of its territory for defensive purposes. The Finns, not thrilled about the idea of handing over their land to Stalin, refuse. So, the USSR invades with over 400,000 troops, tanks, bombers, the works. They are expecting a quick and overwhelming victory. After all, Finland has a tiny army, barely any tanks, and a population that is smaller than the number of Soviet troops on the front lines. This should be easy, but it's not, because the Soviets forgot to check the weather or the geography or Finnish history. The winter of 1939 to 1940 turns out to be one of the coldest in decades, with temperatures dropping below -40 degrees Celsius, which is also -40 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. And the Finns, they are built for it. They have white camouflage, skis, an intimate knowledge of the forests, and a very serious grudge. You're a Red Army soldier, and you start to realize that something is off when your boots freeze to your own feet overnight. The canvas tents offer very little protection. The food, when you get it, is frozen solid. You can't even light a cigarette without your lips sticking to the filter. The cold becomes a weapon, and the Finns are experts in using it. Here is your historical fact. Despite being outnumbered by more than 3 to 1, Finland held off the Soviet invasion for over 3 months, inflicting massive casualties on them. Around 126,000 Soviet troops were killed or went missing. The Finnish losses were heavy too, but proportionally, the Soviets were getting absolutely wrecked. Part of that was strategy. Part of it was the terrain. But a huge part of it was just the cold. Finnish soldiers wearing wool-lined coats and fur hats moved through the forests on their skis like ghosts. They would appear, attack, and then vanish into the trees before the Soviets could even react. Meanwhile, the Soviet tanks froze, literally froze. Their engines wouldn't start. The metal cracked and the fuel turned to slush. Their troops, packed into poorly insulated transport vehicles and unfamiliar with the extreme conditions, began dropping not from gunfire, but from frostbite. And then there is the quirky fact, which somehow makes it all even more surreal. The Finns created homemade explosives out of alcohol, tar, and potassium chlorate, and they tossed them like fiery snowballs into the Soviet tanks. You know the name, Molotov cocktails. Yep, those came from here. The term was actually a dark joke, named after the Soviet foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, who had claimed that the USSR was dropping food supplies on Finland, not bombs. The Finns responded by calling the Soviet bombs Molotov bread baskets, and their explosive response the cocktail to go with it. But the most brutal aspect of the war wasn't the bombs. It was still the cold. Soviet soldiers froze to death in their trenches, their fingers blackened and snapped, their eyelashes turned white. There are stories of entire units huddling together for warmth, only to be found days later, frozen solid in a grotesque embrace of survival instinct and failure. The supply lines couldn't keep up. The fuel depots iced over. The soldiers literally burned their own ammunition crates just to stay alive. Scholars continue to debate just how decisive the winter was compared to the Finnish strategy. Some argue that the Soviets would have fumbled the invasion even in mild weather, due to their poor leadership and outdated tactics. Others insist that the cold turned a likely Soviet victory into a humiliating slog. The truth, as usual, is a frosty mixture of both. What is certain is that the weather humbled an empire. By March of 1940, the Winter War officially ended with the Moscow Peace Treaty. Finland ceded some of its territory, but it retained its independence, which was a rare outcome when the Soviet Union came knocking. Stalin was embarrassed. His army had taken a severe beating, both from bullets and from blizzards. The Finns, meanwhile, emerged with their pride intact and their reputation for resilience carved into ice. And what about you? You are back in the present, lying under a mountain of blankets, listening to the hum of the heater and the distant hush of the wind against your window. You try to imagine what it must have felt like to trudge through a frozen forest in complete silence. Your rifles slung across your back, knowing that every breath you took might be your last. Not from a bullet, but from the cold itself. The Winter War isn't one of the headline-grabbing conflicts. It's often overshadowed by the larger nightmares of World War II. But in those woods, under those gray skis, men fought and died because winter demanded it. The Finns weren't just fighting Stalin. They were fighting snow, frost, hunger, and despair. And they won, not with numbers, but with endurance. Because sometimes, war isn't just man versus man. Sometimes it is man versus the planet. And in 1939, Finland proved that knowing how to ski and survive a whiteout mattered just as much, if not more, than having tanks and planes. The Earth picked a side that winter, and it wasn't the one with more soldiers. You are standing on cracked, barren earth, the color of bone-dry toast, staring at a field that used to grow wheat or corn. Or maybe it was meant to grow anything but dust. The wind picks up, and with it comes another black blizzard. A storm that is made not of rain, but of the soil itself. You pull a bandana over your mouth and you squint into the swirling darkness. It is Oklahoma, sometime in the 1930s. And while most people remember the Dust Bowl for its choking drought and its endless dirt, fewer people talk about what came after it. Because when the dust finally settled, it froze. That's right. As if 10 years of erosion, crop failure, and economic collapse weren't enough, nature decided to toss in a few brutal winters just for flavor. And so tonight, we visit one of the most overlooked chapters in the slow-moving apocalypse of the Dust Bowl. Its hidden deep freezes where temperatures plummeted across the Great Plains and the Midwest, turning desperation into something icier, meaner, and even harder to survive. And just imagine this. It is December of 1935. Your crops are already gone. The bank has taken your tractor. Your roof leaks dust when it should be leaking rain. But now there is ice on your windows, thick enough to etch your name in with a fingernail. Snow is blanketing the bare, eroded land, and it doesn't even look real. It's like someone has layered powdered sugar over a graveyard. The wheat fields are dead. The topsoil has long since blown into someone else's county, and now you have to deal with frostbite on top of everything else. Historical fact. During the winter of 1935 to 1936, temperatures across parts of the U.S. dropped to historic lows. The Great Plains recorded weeks of sub-zero weather. In North Dakota, it hit minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, which is minus 51 degrees Celsius. People froze to death just trying to walk to the barn. Trains stopped running. Snowdrifts piled up higher than the windows. Schools closed for months if they hadn't already been shut down due to the dust and poverty. In Nebraska and Kansas, families burned anything they could find. Broken fences, dried cow patties, even their furniture just to keep warm. The Dust Bowl winters weren't just cold, they were cruel. The dryness from the years of drought meant that there was very little moisture in the air. So when the cold came, it cut straight through everything. There was no humidity to soften the blow. The cold was sharp, surgical. It seeped into the walls, into lungs, and into bones. And because people were already struggling to survive in the best of conditions, this just pushed them closer to the edge. Here is the quirky part. The very dust that had ruined the land sometimes insulated their homes. Weirdly enough, some families reported that the dust piling up outside their houses actually kept their soddies a little bit warmer, acting like an ugly, filthy blanket. Of course, it also got into their food, their lungs, and their teeth. So it wasn't a great trade-off. Still, in a twisted kind of way, the dust both gave and it took away. You had to respect it, even as you were choking on it. You picture yourself in a tiny farmhouse now. It has no insulation, no central heating, just a cast iron stove and a pile of wood that looks far too small for what is coming. The snow outside is crusted over, its top layer shimmering in the moonlight. Your kids are asleep, bundled up in coats and feed sacks that have been stitched into makeshift blankets. You are wearing every piece of clothing that you own, but your fingers still sting from the cold. The fire crackles low and sullen. You don't know how many more nights you can stretch this out. And the cows are either dead or dying, their water troughs frozen completely solid. Your wife chipped a tooth trying to break the ice. You can't afford to buy coal. You can't afford to buy anything. The price of grain is still in the gutter, and the government is promising that relief is on its way. But it feels like empty words that are being spoken through frozen telephone lines. And when you finally step outside in the morning, the sky is clear, but the snow glows with a faint tint of red-brown dust, like the land itself is still bleeding. Scholars don't talk much about the cold of the Dust Bowl years. The drought always steals the spotlight, but the weather records don't lie. The winters of the mid-1930s were some of the worst on record, particularly in the Midwest. Meteorologists still study that period today, scratching their heads over the wild temperature swings, the way that blizzards followed dust storms like aftershocks. One theory suggests that the massive soil erosion and the heat absorption during the summer may have triggered more violent winter systems. Another suggests that it was just bad timing. A natural cycle of Arctic fronts meeting an already weakened landscape. And that's the scary part. No one fully agrees on how it all fit together. Drought, dust, and freeze, all dancing in a grim waltz of climatic misfortune. There is even some speculation that volcanic activity from the early 1930s might have nudged the global temperatures just enough to throw the North American weather out of its rhythm. Maybe. Or maybe it was just the planet reminding everyone who is really in charge. You return now to your warm bed, letting the images of frozen prairie towns melt away. But it lingers, doesn't it? The thought of huddling beneath patched quilts while a blizzard slaps against the door, knowing that there is no food in the pantry, no money in the bank, and no crops in the ground. Just another morning waiting for the sun to rise and hoping that this time it brings warmth instead of more wind. The Dust Bowl wasn't just about dryness. It was about extremes. Too dry, too cold, too cruel. And through it all, people didn't give up. They froze, they cracked, they broke, but many of them kept on going. Because even when nature folds its arms and refuses to cooperate, sometimes the only thing that is left is stubbornness and a good, solid stove. You are not wearing the right shoes for this. That is the first thing that you notice as you step onto a slushy cobblestone street. Your soles immediately soak through because you are in Naples, of all places, a city that is known for its pizza, its sunshine, its wild scooters, and its laundry-draped balconies. Not historically for snow, but on this rare and unsettling morning in the heart of southern Italy, it is white outside. It is not fog, it is not ash. It is snow, thick, cold, and unwelcome. And the locals are staring up at the sky like it is raining frogs. It is the winter of 1709. And yes, it is the same one that crushed France in a glacier-fueled economic spiral. But here, way down in the Mediterranean, something even stranger is happening. Because this region almost never sees any snow. It is like waking up in Miami to find that your pool is frozen and there is a snowman in the shallow end. It just doesn't compute. And yet, here it is, Naples, powdered like a Christmas card, but without any of the joy. The orange trees are drooping, their fruit frozen mid-ripening. The stone steps that lead up to the churches are slick with ice. The Vesuvius silhouetted skyline is glazed in frost, and the people are confused, cold, and more than a little superstitious. Here is your historical fact. This was not just a one-time fluke. Naples recorded multiple snowfalls over the 17th and 18th centuries, often coinciding with particularly harsh winters in northern Europe. But 1709 stands out because it was not just a sprinkle of snow. It was a full-blown freeze, part of the larger Great Frost event that we have already visited. This was not winter getting playful. This was winter invading. Locals at the time wrote about the cold like it was a punishment from God. The churches filled with people who were praying for warmth, for spring, for forgiveness. Because what else could explain snow in Naples? The city's fountains froze completely solid. The fish markets had to shut down, not because of the ice on the roads, but because the sea itself began to freeze along the shoreline. You imagine standing on the edge of the Bay of Naples and seeing slush lapping at the dock. Salt water frozen. That is not normal. That is ominous. And here is a quirky bit of fringe history. Some astrologers of the time blamed a planetary alignment for the snow. Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars had been stacking up in the sky, and the more esoteric thinkers were convinced that when the planets get too cozy, the Earth gets nervous. So nervous that it freezes. Others, more grounded but still creative, thought that it was volcanic steam from Vesuvius reacting with the sea air and creating a localized snowstorm. It was an imaginative stretch for sure, but people were grasping for anything that made the ice make any sense. Now, let's back up a few years. The mid to late 1600s saw strange winters all across the Mediterranean. In Rome, the Tiber River froze over. People skated under the ancient bridges. In Sicily, a frost killed off olive trees that had been growing for generations. Even parts of North Africa saw snowfall. This was not just a one-city phenomenon. It was a southern chill that reached places that were thought to be impervious to winter's worst. Climatologists now think that these odd cold snaps were part of the Little Ice Age, amplified by volcanic activity like the eruption of Mount Etna in 1669. It was a big one that likely disturbed the regional weather patterns. Ash clouds, solar dimming, jet stream weirdness. It all adds up, sort of, but there is still debate about it. Mediterranean snowfall is so rare that many of the ancient accounts of it are written in wide-eyed disbelief, which makes them both fascinating and frustrating for modern historians. Was it really snow, or was it hail or frost that was mistaken for flurries? But in 1709 there is no doubt about it. Naples is frozen and the consequences ripple outward. The citrus crops are lost. The vineyards suffer. Grain imports slow down because shipping becomes dangerous. And the poorest suffer the most, as they always do. You walk past a family that is huddled outside a shuttered bakery. The father's beard is rimmed with ice. The mother is wrapping her shawl around a baby so tightly that it looks like a bundle of rags. They are waiting for the church bells to ring. Sometimes that means that there will be soup. Sometimes it just means that there will be another funeral. And what about you? You are staying in a villa on the hillside. Normally, you would have a view of the sparkling bay, the islands dotting the horizon. But today, all you can see is fog and frost. You try to warm your hands by a tiny fireplace that is barely lit because the wood is too damp to burn properly. The stone walls are sweating with cold, and even wrapped in blankets, you are still shivering. In the city, someone builds a snowman clumsily, joylessly. People gather around not to admire it but to cross themselves. It is unnatural, they whisper. The kids are not laughing. They are hungry, they are scared. The novelty of the snow wears off fast when there is no firewood and the pasta is frozen in its pot. By the end of the month, the snow melts, the streets flood, and the cold gives way to wet. Disease follows. The runoff carries sewage into the drinking water. The hospitals fill up, and just like that, Naples goes from freezing to rotting, all within a few brutal weeks. Modern scholars look back on this and they scratch their heads. How did Naples, a city that is not known for wool coats and sleds, handle these mini ice ages? The answer is not well. There is very little infrastructure for extreme cold in warm weather cities even today. Back then, it was just chaos, and not the good kind. Just suffering, poorly documented, and swept under the rug of southern sunshine once the thaw finally came. You lie in your bed now, the heater humming, not a single snowflake in sight. But the idea of Naples under a blanket of snow lingers, doesn't it? That quiet dissonance. Palm trees that are frosted like pastries, fishermen slipping on icy piers, saints in stained glass staring down at frozen pews. A city that is out of place in its own climate, blinking in confusion at the sky. Because sometimes, history is not about big battles or famous names. Sometimes, it is about the day that winter took a vacation to the south and ruined everything. You are climbing a staircase that is so steep and snow-covered that it might as well be carved into the side of a glacier. Your breath comes in short bursts, fogging up the air around your scarf-wrapped face. Below you is a winding mountain road. Above you, the roof of a small wooden inn clings to the side of the cliff like it is afraid of falling off. Welcome to Snow Country. It is not just a poetic nickname, but a brutally literal one. You are in Japan in the early 1800s, walking through the thick, unforgiving winters of Echigo Province, one of the snowiest inhabited regions on Earth. This place is no stranger to snow. It is not just a few inches here and there, but meters, as in 10, sometimes 12 of them. That is 30 feet of snow or more, layered thick on the rooftops until the houses resemble giant, sleeping animals that are buried beneath white fur. People carve tunnels between the buildings. They build second-story doors, not for architectural flair, but because the first floor is often completely snowed in. Snow is a way of life, a way of survival, and sometimes a way of surrender. Here is your historical fact. Some regions in Japan, particularly in Gunma and Aomori, receive over 500 inches or 1,270 centimeters of snow per year. That is more than almost anywhere else on the planet where people actually live, and they have been doing it for centuries. The villages have adapted through the use of snowsheds, shared granaries, multi-generational homes, and an uncanny knack for making peace with the cold. You imagine stepping inside one of those homes now. Your boots are soaked, and your shoulders are aching from carrying water and firewood. Inside, it is warm, dim, and filled with the smell of rice cooking over a sunken hearth. The irari, the ceiling, is stained black from decades of smoke. An old woman is sitting cross-legged, weaving straw sandals by candlelight. You sip hot sake and the warmth spreads out from your belly, and for a moment the snow feels far away. But it never is. It waits just outside, falling in absolute silence. Thick flakes, steady as breath, piling up on the roofs, on the trees, on the memory of everything. Some years it gets so deep that families must spend half of their winter simply digging themselves out. You shovel your roof, your neighbor's roof, the school's roof, and if you don't, the snow will crush it, literally. There are records of homes collapsing under their own white weight. Here is your quirky fringe fact. In the Edo period, certain rural, snow-covered villages developed snow-watching platforms, almost like scenic balconies from which wealthier residents could gaze at the snowfall for entertainment. Yes, while most people were out breaking their backs with shovels, some folks were aesthetically appreciating the blizzard. It was seen as spiritually cleansing, a kind of natural performance art. Nothing like a little class division to season your snowstorm. And yet, life in snow country was not always bleak. It was also beautiful, communal, and deeply tied to rhythm and ritual. The snow insulated the homes, it muffled the sound, and it created a cocoon where families gathered around the fire and passed the long months through storytelling, craft making, and food preservation. This is the season of pickled vegetables, fermented bean paste, dried persimmons, and thick mochi cakes. You prepare for winter all year, and then when it arrives, you give yourself over to it, because fighting it would be like fighting the tide. But of course, things do not always go smoothly. Avalanches are a constant threat. In some regions, entire villages have been relocated after being repeatedly buried. Travel becomes nearly impossible. The children walk to school with yukigeta, which are snowshoes that are made of bamboo, and cloaks that are layered in oil paper to repel the wetness. It is charming in the abstract, until you realize that some of these kids are hiking for miles through snowstorms just to learn their multiplication tables. There is a scholarly debate about how snow country shaped Japanese culture as a whole. Some argue that the stoicism, community cohesion, and minimalism that are often associated with traditional Japanese values come directly from these long winters. Others think that is reading too much into it. That yes, the snow forced adaptation, but it did not define the entire national character. Still, it is hard to ignore the influence when so much of the regional literature, especially from authors like Yasunari Kawabata, centers on the snow's psychological weight. Kawabata even titled his Nobel Prize-winning novel Snow Country, a haunting story that is set in these icy mountain towns where the landscape is both breathtaking and suffocating. The snow is a metaphor, of course, for isolation, memory, longing, but it is also just there, relentlessly falling like time itself. You go outside now, back into the storm. The snow is up to your thighs and it is still falling. The cold is not brutal. It is quiet, persistent, and inevitable. You stop and you look around. Everything is white. The mountains rise around you like frozen waves, and you can hear the soft rumble of snow sliding somewhere in the distance. It is not an avalanche, not yet. It is just gravity doing what gravity does. And here is the most startling part. Despite centuries of hardship, people still live here. They still farm rice in the summer. They still raise families. They still shovel and dry persimmons and watch the snow fall from their second-story porches. They have turned survival into a ceremony. The snow comes and they bow their heads and they wait, not out of defeat but out of respect. Back in your warm bed with the hum of a heater in your ears, You think about what it takes to live a life in a place where half of the year is winter, where getting to school is an expedition and a shovel is as important as a spoon. You think about how snow in the right amounts is beautiful, but when it overstays its welcome, it becomes something else, something heavier, something to build your life around. Not everyone can live in snow country, but for those who do, every winter is a quiet victory. You're standing at the edge of what should be a vast, unforgiving sea, but instead it looks like a pale, rippled field. The Baltic Sea in front of you is frozen over. It is not just crusted with ice, not a delicate film that you might cautiously tiptoe across, but solid, thick, and eerie in its quiet stillness. It is the middle of winter in Sweden, probably in the 17th century, and the horizon is one long, frigid sheet of possibility. You can't see where the sea ends and the sky begins, just a white blur. And the really strange part is that there is a military convoy marching across it. Yes, armies crossing a frozen sea. You are not hallucinating. You are witnessing one of the most bizarre and dangerous logistical feats in all of military history. When winter did not stop war, it enabled it. The year is 1658, and Sweden is locked in a brutal conflict with Denmark. King Charles X Gustav of Sweden is ambitious, aggressive, and just barely crazy enough to think that the weather is on his side. After a string of victories and a hunger for more land, he gets word from his scouts. The sea ice is thick, thicker than anyone had expected, and not just near the coast, but the entire Danish archipelago, which is usually protected by the salty waters of the Little Belt and Great Belt Straits, is frozen completely solid. Suddenly, Denmark is no longer surrounded by water. It is exposed, and Charles sees his moment. Here is your historical fact. During the Second Northern War in February of 1658, the Swedish army conducted the now legendary march across the belts, crossing the frozen sea straits from Jutland to the Danish islands. More than 9,000 soldiers, plus their cavalry, cannons, and supply wagons, moved across the ice-covered Baltic, an act so risky that it sounds like folklore, but it happened and it worked. You imagine being one of those soldiers. You are wearing layers of wool leather and what is left of your courage. You are walking across what your instincts are telling you is wrong. People do not walk on oceans, but there is a commander up ahead shouting encouragement, and 1,000 boots behind you, making retreat impossible. Every creak of the ice beneath your feet sounds like doom. And yet it holds somehow. The march takes days. The wind whips across the flatness, offering no cover, no sound except your own breathing and the soft crunch of the ice underfoot. The horses whinny nervously. The cannons are dragged on sleds. You pass men who have slipped and broken their limbs, others who are frostbitten and silent. But you keep moving because if the ice gives way now, none of it matters. Charles's gamble pays off. His troops reach the island of Zealand unopposed. The Danes, blindsided and completely unprepared for an attack from the ice, are forced into a treaty. The result is the Treaty of Roskilde, where Denmark cedes massive amounts of territory to Sweden: Scania, Blekinge, Halland, and more. Sweden briefly becomes a dominant power in Northern Europe, and it was made possible not by superior tactics or technology, but by a very, very cold winter. Now, here is your quirky fringe fact. During the same period, Parts of the Baltic were so frozen that mail routes were established over the sea with sleds, and even pop-up taverns were set up on the ice. Temporary inns that were built on frozen water, serving hot drinks to travelers who were crossing from one country to another. Just imagine sipping warm mead while sitting on a wooden stool above 20 feet of icy death. People did not just fear the ice, they used it. This was not a one-time fluke, either. The Baltic Sea froze over in other winters as well, especially during the Little Ice Age when the sea ice pushed further south than usual. In 1426, and again in the 18th century, people crossed from Germany to Denmark on foot. Ferries were optional. You just had to wait for January and bring a sled. Scholars still argue over the exact thickness of the ice during Charles's march. Was it uniformly thick, or were some parts barely passable? Did the army spread out to reduce their weight, or did they take risks over thin patches of ice? Some believe that Charles just got lucky. Others think that he had ice scouts mapping it out days ahead of time. The truth is likely a blend of bravado and desperation. Sweden was stretched thin. Charles needed a miracle. Winter gave him one. But it was not without its cost. Not all of the soldiers survived the cold. Frostbite claimed fingers, ears, and feet. Some of the supply wagons were lost. And if the ice had cracked at the wrong moment, if a thaw had come a day earlier, Charles's entire army could have vanished into the sea, and his legacy would have been a footnote about poor timing instead of a chapter about ice-borne conquest. You stand now at the edge of the same sea, imagining it frozen once more. Today, with warming temperatures and rising salinity, the Baltic does not freeze the way that it used to. The odds of repeating a march across the belts today are practically zero. Modern navies do not wait for winter. They send drones. But something about those soldiers walking across a sea with their muskets and cannonballs feels more terrifying, more human. Back in your warm room, you listen to the gentle churn of a dishwasher or the hum of a distant train. There is no creaking ice beneath your feet, no howling winds sweeping across a frozen ocean. Just comfort, predictability, the idea that seas stay liquid and armies stay on land. But for a brief, surreal moment in the 11th century, winter said otherwise, and one king listened. The silence is unbearable. It is not the peaceful kind, but the kind that hums with tension. The kind where each breath feels like it echoes too loudly. You are inside a frozen city, with windows that are taped up, doors that are barricaded, and the air is brittle with fear. Outside it is snowing softly, deceptively gentle. But this is not a peaceful winter. This is Leningrad, 1941. The Nazis have surrounded the city. No one is getting in. No one is getting out. And the cold. The cold is your constant companion, gnawing at your skin, your stomach, your soul. This is the siege of Leningrad, one of the most brutal and harrowing chapters of World War II. For 872 days, from September of 1941 to January of 1944, the city was encircled by German and Finnish forces, cut off from all supplies, and subjected to relentless shelling and starvation. But what made the siege truly unforgettable was the winter, more than one in fact, during which nature joined the assault with deadly precision. Let's talk about the first real winter, from 1941 to 1942. The temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, which is minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The heating systems failed, the pipes froze, and the buildings cracked from the cold. Food was already scarce, but now even boiling water was a challenge. You imagine lighting a fire with torn-up floorboards because there is nothing else to burn. You pull your coat tighter and you realize that it is not a coat. It is a blanket that you have cut armholes into, historical fact. By the end of that first winter, over 600,000 people, mostly civilians, had died in Leningrad. That is more than the total deaths from the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Most of them did not die from bombs or from bullets. They died from hunger and from cold. Starvation was everywhere. People boiled wallpaper for the glue and they ate sawdust bread. There are documented cases of cannibalism, whispered about then but confirmed later. But most people did not resort to that. They simply wasted away. And then came the snow. The snow blanketed the horror in a white silence. Corpses froze on benches, in stairwells, and on the sides of the roads. There were too many to bury. People just stepped over them, numb to it. What else could they do? The ground was too frozen to dig. The bodies were too frozen to move. You walk the icy streets now. Your boots have holes in them. You pass a woman who is carrying a bundle that looks far too light to be wrapped in so many layers. A child trails behind her, dragging a sled that is not for playing. It is for transporting water or maybe something darker. The only sound is the wind, the occasional crack of ice, and maybe an explosion in the distance. And yet somehow the city did not fall. Here is your quirky historical detail. Despite the unimaginable conditions, Leningrad continued to produce art and music. In 1942, the composer Dmitri Shostakovich, himself trapped in the city before being evacuated, wrote his Seventh Symphony, which he named Leningrad. It was performed in the besieged city by an orchestra of starving musicians, some of whom were pulled off the front lines and given extra rations just so that they could play. The concert was broadcast over loudspeakers, not just within Leningrad, but also toward the German lines. Just imagine that. Starving people who were wrapped in rags, sitting in a freezing concert hall, listening to a symphony while bombs were falling in the distance. It was not just music, it was defiance. It was the city saying, "We are still here, we are still human." The scholarly debate surrounding Leningrad's winters centers on this brutal duality. How did a city manage to survive conditions that should have been unsurvivable? Was it Stalin's iron will? Was it the people's resilience? Or was it the cold's equal cruelty to both sides? The truth is likely all of it. What is certain is that winter shaped the entire experience of the siege. Without it, perhaps the Germans would have taken the city, or perhaps the people inside would have broken sooner. But winter leveled the battlefield and it raised the cost. The Soviet response to the cold was both desperate and resourceful. Families sealed their windows with anything that they could find: cloth, newspaper, even their own clothing. Entire apartment blocks became communal living spaces to share the heat. People learned to cook anything that was remotely edible: fermented cabbage, sawdust crackers, and boiled shoe leather. You chewed slowly, savoring the calories like they were treasure. The road of life, a makeshift ice road across the frozen Lake Ladoga, became the city's only lifeline. Trucks carried in food and supplies, skidding across miles of thin, cracking ice, while German bombers circled above them. On the way back, they carried out the sick, the dying, and the hopeful. Many of them never made it. You stand on the edge of Lake Ladoga now, staring at what looks like just another sheet of frozen water. But you know better. Beneath this ice are stories, thousands of them, of heroism, tragedy, and sheer endurance. You can feel the weight of it, the sheer emotional gravity of a city that froze but never surrendered. And then the thaw came slowly, like everything else. The siege was lifted in January of 1944, and the people who remained, emaciated, frostbitten but unbowed, began to rebuild. The buildings were patched up, the railways were reconnected, and the bodies were finally buried. But the scars, both physical and psychological, never fully healed. Back in your bed, you shift beneath your blankets, your stomach full, your fingers warm. You think of the woman in the stairwell, the boy with the sled, the orchestra playing into the cold. You think of a silence that was not peaceful but hollow, and the snow, always the snow, covering everything, not to hide it but to preserve it. Because Leningrad did not just survive a siege, it survived a winter that tried to erase it and failed. You are walking through a quiet neighborhood that does not feel quite real. The trees are leaning under the weight of something that is heavier than snow, something shinier, stranger. Every twig, every blade of grass, every power line and rooftop is encased in a shell of ice, thick, glassy, and glistening under a sky the color of pewter. This is not a fairy tale winter wonderland. It is Canada. It is January of 1998, and you are in the middle of one of the worst ice storms in modern history. At first glance, it is beautiful, absurdly so. Everything is shimmering, frozen in time. You snap a photo, maybe two, before the cold starts biting at your fingertips. And then you hear it, a crack. A soft pop, then a slow, creaking groan like a massive ship breaking apart. And suddenly a tree collapses, dragging a tangle of frozen power lines with it. Sparks fly. And somewhere the lights go out for good. This was the North American ice storm of 1998, and it hit eastern Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and parts of the northeastern U.S. with a level of devastation that is usually reserved for hurricanes or wars. Unlike a blizzard, which is loud and obvious, an ice storm sneaks up on you. It begins with freezing rain, a drizzle that coats every surface, and then locks it into a crystalline prison. For 5 straight days that rain fell, and the world turned to glass. Here is your historical fact. The 1998 ice storm affected over 5 million people. It caused $5.4 billion in damages, and it resulted in 35 direct deaths, with dozens more indirectly due to exposure, fires, or carbon monoxide poisoning from improvised heating. Over 1,000 transmission towers collapsed under the weight of the ice. Some of them were massive steel structures that were bent like twist ties. At its peak, 3 million people were without power, some for over a month. You walk into a grocery store that is lit by candles and flashlights. The shelves are half empty. The generator hums like a dying animal in the background. People are lined up with armfuls of batteries, canned soup, and firewood if they are lucky. You grab what you can. You do not even like Spam, but you take it anyway. And the cold. The cold is immediate and omnipresent. The homes lose their heat quickly. The pipes burst. The basements flood. People huddle under blankets in their living rooms, lighting candles, burning furniture, and breathing into their cupped hands. You visit your neighbors, your elderly relatives, anyone who might be vulnerable. Some of them have fireplaces, Most do not. The lucky ones have gas stoves or generators. The rest just wait. Here is your quirky fringe fact. In some parts of rural Quebec, residents began sleeping in their cars, running them for heat, and taking shifts through the night to prevent carbon monoxide buildup. Others lived in shopping malls, community centers, and even hockey arenas that had been turned into emergency shelters. Just imagine being wrapped in a coat, eating stale cookies, and trying to sleep under fluorescent lights while the world outside freezes in slow motion. But this was not just a local event. The scale of the damage was national. The Canadian military deployed 16,000 troops, which was the largest peacetime deployment in the country's history, to clear debris, deliver supplies, and assist with evacuations. The roads became treacherous or impossible. Crews worked around the clock to restore the power, only to watch fresh ice undo everything that they had just repaired. It was Sisyphean, and it went on for weeks. The emotional toll was just as heavy. People lost their homes. Businesses shuttered. Farms collapsed. Dairy farmers who were unable to milk their cows or refrigerate the milk watched their entire herd suffer. Some of them had to dump gallons of spoiled milk into ditches while their cows shivered in frozen barns. The sound of chainsaws became as common as bird song, cutting fallen trees, clearing driveways, and slicing through the wreckage of a frozen world. Climatologists still analyze the event with a mix of awe and dread. How could it have happened so quickly? How did one slow-moving system manage to unleash such a vast and prolonged disaster? The culprit was a rare alignment of warm air above cold air near the surface, which created the perfect freezing rain conditions. And then that pattern just stalled, dumping moisture over the same regions for nearly 120 hours. It was like someone had hit pause on the atmosphere while slowly twisting the cold knob. The debate continues about how climate change may or may not affect future ice storms. Some argue that warming trends will reduce their frequency. Others suggest that they will become more intense as volatile weather patterns create the perfect chaos cocktail. Either way, what happened in '98 is still considered the benchmark, the nightmare scenario that emergency planners quietly dread. And what about the human response? In the aftermath, people did not riot. They did not loot. They checked on their neighbors. They shared their firewood. The schools closed, but the kids stayed active, helping to shovel snow and carry supplies. Strangers became friends. Families rediscovered board games. There is even a story of a couple who had planned to get a divorce. But after a week in the same freezing house with no power, no internet, and no distractions, they reconciled. Ice therapy, apparently. You walk back through the streets past drifts of broken branches and twisted metal. The world is quiet, stunned. Above you, the sun finally peeks through the clouds, glinting off the ice like everything has been dipped in diamonds. It is gorgeous and terrifying. Back in your room, warm and electrically lit, you glance at your phone, your heater, your flickering screen. You can almost hear the distant creak of branches, the pop of transformers failing one by one. You wonder how long you would last without it all. A few days, a week. Because when winter does not scream, when it does not show up with a blizzard or a frost wave or a roaring wind, but instead it whispers and it coats the world in ice, it is not any less dangerous. In fact, it might be worse. It waits, it weighs, and then it brings everything crashing down quietly. You are squinting into a gray sky. The kind of sky that looks like it wants to say something, but it can't quite get the words out. A cold wind scrapes across the village, not howling, just whispering. The fields are bare, the animals are skittish, and no one has slept well in weeks. It is the early 1600s, somewhere in Central Europe. Maybe Wurzburg or Bamberg, or maybe some smaller town that is too unimportant to make the maps, and people are starting to act strange. The crops have failed again. The winter came early, and it will not let go. And in the bitter quiet of the snow-covered fields and the unheated churches, a chilling thought begins to spread. Someone must be to blame. Welcome to one of the most insidious side effects of a freezing world, the witch hunts. You think that witch hunts were all about torches and pitchforks. Angry mobs chasing old women into the woods, right? That is part of it. But the truth is, it was far colder and far more calculated. During the peak decades of the Little Ice Age, Europe experienced a bizarre and terrifying uptick in witch trials, particularly during the late 1500s and 1600s. And while there were many social and political reasons for this, there is one factor that historians keep circling back to: the weather. Here is your historical fact. Some of the largest and deadliest witch hunts in European history occurred during unusually cold decades. Between 1580 and 1650, thousands of people, mostly women and mostly poor, were accused, tortured, and executed for allegedly causing bad weather. That is right. Frost, hail, blizzards, and failed harvests were all considered to be evidence, apparently, of witchcraft. You step inside a cold stone church where the town magistrates are holding a hearing. A girl of 15 stands accused of summoning a frost demon that ruined the barley crop. The evidence: her neighbor saw her collecting herbs at dusk. She owns a cat. She spoke harshly to a pig that died the next day. And worst of all, she did not attend Mass last Sunday. You know how this ends. In 1626, Bamberg, in what is now southern Germany, hosted one of the most notorious witch trials in history. Over 900 people were executed in a frenzy that lasted for nearly a decade. Entire families were implicated. Their property was seized. Confessions were extracted under torture. So much torture that some suspects confessed to riding whether demons through the sky or milking phantom cows that gave poison cream. The absurdity of it was grotesque, but it was also desperate. People were starving. Their livestock were dying. The winters were long. And when you are freezing and your children are coughing blood into straw beds, you are willing to believe anything that gives you a reason for the suffering. Quirky fringe fact: a pamphlet that was printed in 1563 by a German theologian claimed that witches had gathered in alpine meadows to conjure up snowstorms that would bury Protestant villages. Another account described witches flying over the Swiss Alps in midwinter, using frost-laced whips to steer cloud dragons into enemy farmland. It was fantasy, of course. But when your village has lost its grain for 3 years in a row and the river is frozen solid in April, fantasy starts to look a lot like logic. The scholarly debate here is both fascinating and unsettling. Did the climate instability cause the witch hunts, or did it simply provide the ideal conditions for mass hysteria to thrive? Most agree on this much. When societies are stressed, especially by invisible forces like the climate, scapegoats become inevitable. And who better to blame than the old woman who knows how to make herbal tea, or the widow who talks to her chickens? You walk down a snow-covered road now, past the gallows, past the silent townspeople who avert their eyes. The accused woman from earlier is gone. No one speaks of her anymore. The new snow has fallen, covering the footprints to the prison, to the stake, to the ashes. You ask a farmer how the crops are looking this year, and he just shrugs and stares up at the sky like he is waiting for it to judge him. These were not isolated events. The Scottish witch hunts, the Basque trials, the Salem hysteria, all happened during periods of colder than average weather. There is even a timeline comparison that is floating around academic circles that shows a correlation between temperature dips and spikes in witch executions. Correlation is not causation, but it is hard to ignore. And then there is the way that cold creeps into the mind. Long winters mean long nights, fewer distractions, and tighter quarters. Add hunger, illness, and despair, and people begin to see things. Shadows where there are none, whispers in the trees, a goat that looks at you the wrong way. The line between superstition and survival gets blurry real fast when it is snowing in May. Eventually, the weather warms up slowly. The witch hunts taper off, thanks in part to Enlightenment thinking and, yes, better crops. But the damage is done. Tens of thousands are dead. Their only crime being in the wrong place at the wrong temperature. And you wonder how many of those trials were really about belief and how many were just about fear. You crawl into your bed now, your blankets heavy and warm, a cup of tea cooling on your nightstand. The idea of blaming someone for the weather seems absurd. But deep down, you know how fragile our sense of order really is. How quickly humans reach for someone to punish when nature turns cruel. The cold does not care about fairness. It does not need a reason, but people do. And in the icy grip of the Little Ice Age, reason took a long winter nap. The wind comes in low and heavy, carrying with it not just a chill, but the kind of stillness that feels unnatural, like the earth itself is holding its breath. You are in northern Britain, somewhere near Hadrian's Wall in the 3rd century. The sky is a colorless smear. The Roman outpost that you are standing in creaks under the weight of another unexpected frost. The grain stores are lower than they should be. The locals are restless. And the empire, once sprawling, golden, and eternal, is beginning to feel a bit drafty. Welcome to the slow, frozen unraveling of Rome in the West. Now do not worry. We are not blaming the fall of Rome entirely on the weather. Rome had a long list of problems. Political infighting, overexpansion, military overreach, a currency system that was held together with chewing gum and optimism. But one factor that has been lurking more and more in the academic background is climate instability, and the possibility that a series of brutal winters and cold snaps help to chip away at one of the most powerful empires in history. Here is your historical fact. Tree ring data, ice cores, and sediment records suggest that parts of Europe experienced a sharp dip in temperatures during the late Roman period, particularly from the mid-200s through the 500s CE. This period is sometimes called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, and while the name might be a bit of a mouthful, its impact was not subtle. Shorter growing seasons, unseasonal frosts, and weird shifts in rainfall patterns wreaked havoc on Roman agriculture. You imagine a Roman farmer near the Danube, staring at his fields, which are still muddy in June, watching his wheat fail to ripen on time. The calendar says that it is harvest season, but the crops disagree. The granaries are low. The local magistrate is nervous. The soldiers have not been paid, and the Germanic tribes to the north are watching, always watching. And speaking of tribes, let's talk about the migration period. Between the 4th and 6th centuries, Europe saw a massive wave of movements by groups like the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, and the Huns. Were they all just looking for conquest and land? Sure, but they were also chasing better weather. Some historians argue that colder winters and failed harvests in Central Asia and Northern Europe pushed populations southward, right into Roman territory, a domino effect of frozen valleys and empty stomachs that led eventually to the sack of Rome itself. Quirky fringe fact: some accounts claim that when Alaric and the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 CE, they were actually better fed and more organized than the starving Roman population that they conquered. Rome had not just lost its edge, it had lost its climate advantage. The warming period that helped to build the empire, what we now call the Roman climate optimum, was long over, and winter, like an unwelcome tenant, had moved in without asking. Back on the frontier, you are huddled in a Roman outpost that is half stone, half desperation. You wrap a wool cloak around your shoulders, and you try to forget that the legion that used to protect this region has been reassigned or disbanded entirely. The Picts are growing bolder. Bandits are stalking the old roads, and the roads themselves are cracked, overgrown, and slowly being reclaimed by weeds and snow. In Rome, meanwhile, the politics are melting down faster than the spring thaw. Emperors come and go. Some are assassinated, some are exiled, and some just vanish. Famine hits different regions every few years. Civil war becomes a seasonal event. The rich flee to their country villas, and the poor are left to freeze in crumbling tenements, hoping that the next winter is not worse than the last. Here is where the scholarly debate gets spicy. Some historians still downplay the climate's role in Rome's decline, arguing that social, military, and economic factors were far more significant. Fair enough. But others point to the increased frequency of droughts, floods, and cold waves as stress multipliers. Forces that did not cause the collapse outright, but they accelerated it. Think of them as the final straw, layered in frost. There is even archaeological evidence that supports this. Layers of frozen grain residue in certain storage pits, shifts in animal husbandry, cattle being replaced by smaller, hardier livestock, a sudden rise in burial pits in some areas during known cold periods. It is not just a theory, it is physical. You wander now through a ruined villa on the edge of the former empire. Snow drifts in through the broken columns. The mosaics, which were once vibrant, are now faded and cracked. You can still see the outlines of Roman grandeur, but it has all been dulled by time, ice, and neglect. A frozen silence rests over everything, broken only by the wind. It is not dramatic. It is slow, like frost creeping into the corners of a once glorious painting. And then, somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls, a church maybe. Because as the empire fell, something else rose in its place. Christianity, monasteries, quiet centers of survival and memory. Many of them were built in remote, cold places where the winters taught humility and the snow became routine. The empire did not just vanish. It melted, reshaped by the cold into something new. You tuck your feet under your warm blanket and you try to imagine a world where the fall of a civilization did not come from invasion or from fire, but from years of disappointing springs, from hungry bellies and long winters, from a sun that stopped shining quite so brightly. Because sometimes it is not the sword that brings down a giant. Sometimes it is a cold breeze. Your breath is fogging up the inside of your helmet. You have already stopped trying to keep your hands warm. There is no point. The gloves help, but not enough. You flex your fingers slowly, just to remind yourself that they are still there. Around you is a world of ice, slick, white and blinding in the morning sun. You are on a ridge that is overlooking the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea in December of 1950. And it is not just the enemy that you are fighting. It is the cold itself. This is the Korean War, and you are smack in the middle of one of its most brutal chapters, the Battle of Chosin, where the temperatures dropped so low that weapons jammed, blood froze, and frostbite became more feared than bullets. The Korean War is not always the first one that gets remembered. But for those who fought in it, especially here in the mountains of northeastern Korea during the winter of 1950, there is no forgetting it. Because this was not just a battle, it was a climatic nightmare. And it changed the way that militaries thought about weather, possibly forever. Historical fact: during the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, the temperatures dropped to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, which is minus 37 degrees Celsius, with wind chills that made it feel even colder. This was not some short, cold snap. It was a sustained, punishing deep freeze that lasted through the entire 17-day battle. The U.S. Marines and other United Nations forces were encircled by 120,000 Chinese troops. They were outnumbered, undersupplied, and surrounded, but the 1st Marine Division fought its way out in the snow, over the mountains, and under constant attack. Their motto was, "Retreat, hell. We're just attacking in another direction." But the enemy was not just China. It was winter. You can barely fire your weapon. The oil in the rifles has congealed. Soldiers are urinating on their gun parts just to warm them up enough to function. Grenades will not detonate because the fuses are frozen. Sea rations become inedible bricks of beef stew. The radio batteries die within minutes. Bandages freeze to the wounds. And every night you sleep next to men who might not wake up come morning. You are wearing every layer of gear that you have got. It does not help. Your feet are numb. Your ears are ringed with ice. You are not thinking about tactics or glory anymore. You are thinking about whether you will still have toes by the end of this patrol. You wonder how long a man can last in this cold before his body just gives up. And here is your quirky fringe fact. The Marine Corps issued Mickey Mouse boots, which were massive rubberized footwear that was designed to trap warm air. But they arrived too late for many at Chosin. Before that, the soldiers were stuffing newspaper, extra socks, and even toilet paper into their boots to stave off frostbite. It worked, sort of, but not well enough. Thousands were evacuated, not because of wounds, but because their limbs were turning black. Military historians often point to Chosin as a miracle of endurance, a tactical withdrawal under apocalyptic conditions. The terrain was unforgiving. The roads were icy death traps. Evacuation was nearly impossible. The helicopters, when they could fly, carried the injured out one by one. But the fighting did not stop. The retreat was a battle in itself. Over mountains, through ambushes, and in the kind of cold that makes your soul ache, and the numbers were devastating. Of the 30,000 UN troops that were involved, around 17,000 of them became casualties, many due to frostbite. The Chinese forces suffered even more, up to 50,000, including tens of thousands who froze to death in their thin cotton uniforms. The Chinese soldiers had no winter gear and no medical support. They attacked anyway, wave after wave. Some of them never even made it within rifle range. They froze before they could fight. There is still debate among scholars and military analysts about whether the UN forces could have anticipated such extreme conditions. Should they have had better winter gear, better supplies? Maybe. But even now, the weather at Chasen is seen as a once-in-a-century anomaly, a perfect storm of terrain, temperature, and tactical chaos. Some believe that the cold actually saved lives, slowing down the Chinese advances, freezing the roads, and giving the UN just enough breathing room to escape. Others argue that it almost destroyed the division completely. You pull back from the memory, wrapped in your own blanket, the heater purring softly in the corner. And you try to imagine what it was like, standing in a foxhole that was full of snow, your boots soaked, your fingers blackening, watching the flares pop in the sky as the enemy troops moved in again. You chew on a frozen chocolate bar because it is the only thing that you can stomach. You wrap a scarf around your face so that the skin will not split open from the wind. You cry, but the tears freeze on your cheeks. And through all of it, you keep going, because the cold does not care if you are a Marine or a civilian. It does not care who wins or who loses. It just takes heat, movement, and memory. The men who survived Chasen were called the Frozen Chasen. It is a nickname that sounds almost light-hearted until you understand what it cost them. Today, Chasen is studied in military academies around the world, not just for its tactics, but for what it taught. Weather is a weapon. The earth itself can be an ally or an enemy. It can turn soldiers into statues. It can freeze a war in place. You lie still now, warm and safe, and you try not to take it for granted. Because for those 17 days in the winter of 1950, warmth was a distant dream, and the world was nothing but snow, blood, and breath. You are standing in a trench, knee-deep in mud and ice water, staring out across a barren, frozen field of shattered trees and silent craters. It is Europe. It is 1916, and you are on the Western Front of World War I. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas 2 years ago has turned into a grinding, frozen stalemate. And now, with winter pressing down like a leaden sky, you are learning what thousands already know. Cold does not stop a war, it just makes it more miserable. You are wrapped in a heavy wool coat that has not been dry since you were issued it. Your gloves are stiff with frost. Your boots might as well be buckets. Every toe that you have feels like it belongs to someone else. The smell down here is part rot, part gunpowder, and part something worse. It is the smell of wet fabric that has forgotten what dry feels like. Someone coughs. Someone else mutters a prayer. The morning frost crunches underfoot, and then it gives way to slush. You are not sure which is worse. Here is your historical fact. The winter conditions on the Western Front were so brutal that entire battalions suffered mass casualties from exposure alone. In the winter of 1916 to 1917, the temperatures in France dropped well below freezing, with heavy snowfalls that clogged the trenches, froze the equipment, and immobilized the men. Frostbite and trench foot became epidemic. The medical stations were overwhelmed, not just with wounds but with blackened limbs, swollen joints, and soldiers who simply could not stop shivering. And then there is the snow. It softens the battlefield, it dulls the edges. The bullets still fly, but they land with quieter thuds. The artillery is no less deadly, but the sound is stranger, muffled by the powder-dusted fields. You think that might be a kindness until you realize that the snow also conceals the bodies. And in a trench war where land is gained and lost by the yard, that means stepping over someone who might not be sleeping. You watch as a young private pours hot water into a metal mug and stirs in a chunk of whatever is passing for coffee today. The steam rises and it vanishes instantly. He hands it to you. You sip. It is mostly warm, mostly bitter, and entirely priceless. Little comforts mean everything when the world outside is a hell that is frozen over. Here is your quirky fringe fact. To combat trench foot, the officers eventually ordered the troops to grease their feet with whale oil before putting on dry socks. Each soldier required multiple tins of the stuff, applied daily. It helped marginally, but you still ended up with medical diaries that were full of grotesque drawings, of feet that were ballooned to twice their size, of toes that were like purple marshmallows, and of nails that were peeling off like wet bark. You hear about the Christmas truce of 1914, when soldiers from both sides emerged from their trenches, shook hands, exchanged cigarettes, and even played soccer in the snow. It sounds almost quaint now because that was before the war became machinery, before the gas, the tanks, and the endless waves of mud and steel. By the time 1916 arrives, that magic is gone. No one is singing carols anymore. The snow is not festive. It is just more weight on a war that already feels like it might last forever. And now for the academic squabble. Some scholars argue that winter slowed the pace of the war, offering natural ceasefires due to the impossible conditions. Others claim that it made things worse, trapping the soldiers, making the supply lines even more fragile, and turning minor infections into amputations. There is no consensus, but everyone agrees on this. The cold did not help. It did not kill as fast as the guns did, but it worked steadily, silently in the background. You remember reading somewhere that the generals planned entire offensives around the weather. They would wait for a thaw, a freeze, a fog. Sometimes that played in their favor. Other times it led to disasters like the Battle of Passchendaele, where soldiers drowned in mud-filled craters during torrential autumn rains. Rains that quickly gave way to frost, trapping the dead in icy shells. You look down at your own boots now. They are caked in layers of slush and grime, and somewhere beneath that is a sock that you have not changed in days. You can't feel your toes. You do not want to, because if you do, you will realize that they have already gone numb. And numbness in a trench is never a good sign. The shelling starts again. Distant thuds at first, then closer. You duck instinctively, even though you have been through this before. Snow sprays up from the lip of the trench. Somewhere someone yells. Somewhere else someone does not. You press your back against the icy wall of the trench and you breathe slowly through your nose. One breath, too. The snow falls again, undisturbed by the violence. It always comes back like it has no memory of what it covered yesterday. And then the quiet returns. It is not peace, just silence. You pull your coat tighter, you sip the last of your coffee, and you listen to the wind whistling through the broken, barbed wire. Back in your bed now, the blanket soft and forgiving. You think about those men. They were boys, really, frozen in the mud, writing letters home with their shaking hands, telling their mothers that they are fine, that the cold is not so bad, that Christmas will be nice this year. They did not talk about trench rot, or frozen rice, or trying to sleep with rats that were nestled in their armpits for warmth. That is the part that they left out, because what happens in a frozen trench in northern France does not make for polite conversation. It stays there, buried under the snow and the silence and time. But history remembers, and so do you. You are walking across a darkened city, your boots clicking on the frozen asphalt, your breath puffing out in white bursts that vanish almost as quickly as they appear. Above you, the sky is black, clear, and utterly still. It is the kind of cold that feels like it is waiting for something, listening. You pass by shuttered shops, dark homes, and lampposts that are flickering dimly, if at all. You are in Texas, of all places, in February of 2021, and what you are feeling is not just cold, it is collapse. This was supposed to be a quick winter snap, a novelty maybe, something that people would laugh about on social media while sipping cocoa and posting selfies in the rare snow. But then the power went out, and then the water stopped running. And then people started dying in their homes, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by candles and silence. This was not quaint. This was Winter Storm Uri, one of the most devastating and surreal weather disasters in recent U.S. memory. Historical fact. In mid-February of 2021, an Arctic air mass descended far further south than usual, plunging the state of Texas and large swaths of the southern U.S. into a deep freeze. The temperatures dropped to -2 degrees Fahrenheit, which is -19 degrees Celsius, in places like Dallas. Millions of people lost power as the state's power grid, which is isolated, deregulated, and deeply unprepared for the cold, buckled under the demand. Rolling blackouts became full outages. Frozen pipes burst. Water treatment facilities failed. Grocery stores emptied in hours. The roads iced over. People were trapped in the dark and the cold with no idea when it would end. And here you are walking through it, looking up at the stars and wondering how a place that is known for its barbecue, sunburns, and air conditioning suddenly became the setting for a slow-motion disaster movie. You pass by a family that is huddled in a parked car, the engine idling. You can smell the gasoline and you can hear the faint hum of the heat. They are not going anywhere. They are living in that car tonight. You see another house with flickering lights and a cord that is snaking out to the driveway where it plugs into a neighbor's generator. Sharing power, sharing survival. No one is asking political questions right now. They are asking, do you have heat? Or can I borrow some water? Now for the quirky fringe detail. In some neighborhoods, the locals began melting snow in buckets just to flush their toilets. Others used pool water or even boiled water from their hot tubs. There were even reports of campfires being built inside living rooms, chimneys or not. A fire marshal in Houston described the scene as a return to pre-industrial life overnight. The smell of wood smoke mixed with the sound of emergency sirens and cracking pipes. And it was not just the cold. It was the infrastructure failure. Texas operates its own power grid, ERCOT, which is largely disconnected from the two national grids that cover the rest of the country. That independence, while it is useful for avoiding federal regulation, came with a cost. No backup and no easy way to borrow energy from other states when the demand spiked. And because Texas does not usually get Arctic temperatures, most of its power plants were not weatherized. The turbines froze. The natural gas lines clogged with ice. The equipment failed not because of the snow, but because it was never meant to operate in these conditions, and the debate exploded. Some blamed wind power, others pointed to the gas infrastructure. Some shouted about green energy failure. Others pointed out that this was not a political failure. It was a planning failure, one that left 4.5 million people without power in freezing conditions, one that killed at least 246 people, though some experts believe that the real number is far higher. Not all deaths in freezing homes make the news, and the most unsettling part is that it was not that cold. Not compared to, say, Minnesota or Canada. The problem was not the temperature, it was the unpreparedness. A modern state that was brought to its knees not by a blizzard but by a weather system that wandered a little too far south. You pass by a woman who is carrying firewood in a plastic laundry basket. Her breath is sharp, her face is red. She nods at you, the kind of nod that says, "Yeah, this is real." A dog trots beside her, its paws lifting high in the snow. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wails and then it cuts out. You pass by a grocery store with a handwritten sign that is taped to the window. It says, "No water, no bread, no milk. Try again tomorrow." Some scholars now call this a climate wake-up call, not because it was caused by climate change directly, but because it showed how fragile even rich, developed societies are when the weather steps out of bounds. As warming continues, weird winters like Uri could become more common. Polar vortexes dipping lower, jet streams meandering like lost rivers. It will not always be hotter. Sometimes it will be colder in places that are not ready for it. There is already a debate about how to fortify the grid, with weatherproofing, regulation, and redundancy. But the conversation comes too late for the people who froze in mobile homes, in apartments without insulation, and in houses where the pipes exploded like water balloons. Back in your own space, warm, well-lit, and humming with stable electricity, you try to shake the feeling, but it sticks. The idea that just a few degrees of cold in the wrong place at the wrong time can turn a state upside down. That the weather does not need to be record-breaking to be catastrophic. It just needs to outpace the plan. And maybe that is the lesson for tonight. That winter does not always look like war or famine or collapse on the scale of empires. Sometimes it looks like a ceiling fan that is frozen in place, a sleeping bag that is unzipped on a living room floor, a mother who is boiling snow to bathe her kids. Sometimes it looks like a flashlight beam that is cutting through a dark hallway, looking for a switch that no longer works. And now here you are, warm, safe, your eyes heavy, wrapped in blankets that mercifully have not frozen to your skin. The room is still. The lights are soft. There is probably a gentle hum in the background, your fan maybe, or the fridge doing its quiet mechanical breathing. You have made it through not just this bedtime story, but through 1,000 years of winter, one icy footstep at a time. You have traveled across myth and empire, famine and firewood, siege and snowfall. You have marched with Napoleon until your breath turned to frost. You have huddled inside a Leningrad apartment, waiting for a soup that would not come. You have watched the Mississippi freeze, the Baltic become a highway, and southern Italy stare blankly at a snow that should not exist. You have learned that history is not just made in the summer when kings parade and crops wave in the breeze. It is also made in the dead of winter, when everything slows down, shivers, and sometimes stops altogether. There is something deeply humbling about that, is not there. The idea that ice, not ideology, not invention, not ambition, can undo everything. That all it takes is a sky that has gone quiet, a sun that hides for too long, and suddenly the strongest systems begin to creak. No matter how advanced we think we are, we still wear coats, we light fires, and we check the weather apps before we leave the house. We are still just people in the cold, hoping that the thaw comes soon. But there is also resilience, because time and again, through all of these stories, someone figures it out. They dig the roof out, or they build a better boot, or they write a symphony in the middle of a siege. People adapt, they survive. Not always beautifully, not always fairly, but enough to keep going. And maybe that is what matters. So now, finally, you can let it go. Let your mind wander somewhere quieter, somewhere warmer. The ice is behind you. The fire is crackling. The danger has passed. Let the snow keep falling if it wants to.